The Harley-Davidsons arrived like rolling thunder across the Nebraska prairie, their chrome catching the late afternoon sun as they roared down Highway 80 toward the small town of Millfield. Dust clouds kicked up behind the convoy of 12 motorcycles, each one a testament to rebellion wrapped in leather and steel. The sound wasn't just mechanical, it was primal. A heartbeat of American defiance that had been pounding since the 1940s, when men came back from war and found the quiet suburbs too small for their restless souls. If this story grabs you already, smash that like button. This tale of unlikely heroes is going to take just 8 minutes of your time, but will change how you see community forever. Don't forget to subscribe for more incredible true stories. Jake Morrison felt the familiar vibration through his bones as he led the pack, his weather hands gripping the handlebars of his 1975 shovelhead like they were extensions of his own arms. His salt and pepper beard caught the wind beneath his half-helmet, and the weight of the club's colors, the Death's Head logo embroidered on the back of his leather vest, felt heavier today than it had in years. Behind him rode the core of the Omaha chapter, Diesel, whose massive frame made even the biggest Harley look like a toy. Raven, the only woman in their group, whose black hair streamed like a war banner. Tommy Quick Martinez, barely 25 but already sporting the 1,000-yard stare that came with the territory. And 8 others who'd answered the call when word came down about the charity ride. They weren't heading to Millfield for trouble, quite the opposite. They were coming to help. The fundraiser had been organized by Emma Chen, a pediatric oncologist at Nebraska Medical Center, whose 8-year-old daughter Emma had been diagnosed with leukemia 2 years earlier. Emma was in remission now, her small frame stronger than anyone had dared hope, but Sarah had seen too many other families struggle with the financial burden that came with fighting for their child's life. She'd mortgaged her house, sold her car, and organized every fundraising event she could think of. When someone suggested reaching out to the local motorcycle clubs, bikers love helping kids, they'd said, she'd swallowed her preconceptions and made the call. Jake had taken that call personally. His own granddaughter, Lily, was 7 years old, with Emma's same bright eyes and unshakable optimism. The thought of any child going through what Emma had endured hit him in places he didn't like to acknowledge existed. So he'd put the word out. Anyone who could ride would ride. No politics, no territorial disputes, no club business, just human beings showing up for other human beings. The town of Millfield appeared on the horizon like something out of a Norman Rockwell painting, if Rockwell had painted during the economic decline of rural America. Main Street stretched for exactly 6 blocks, lined with buildings that had seen better decades. The grain elevators still stood tall against the sky, a monument to the agricultural heritage that had built the town, but half the storefronts displayed for lease signs that had been there so long they'd faded to the color of old bones. The Millfield Community Center sat at the heart of downtown, a modest brick building that had served as everything from a polling place to a wedding venue since 1962. Today, colorful balloons were tied to every available post and railing, and handmade signs proclaimed Emma's Heroes Fundraiser in bright, hopeful letters. Cars were already parked along the street, mostly pickup trucks, a few minivans, the practical vehicles of working families who understood that sometimes community meant showing up even when your own bank account was tight. As the motorcycles rumbled into town, Jake could see people stopping on the sidewalks, their conversations dying mid-sentence as they turned to watch the convoy pass. Some faces showed curiosity, others concern, and a few displayed the kind of naked fear that came from decades of media representations that painted every biker as a potential threat. They pulled into the community center's parking lot with the practiced precision of riders who'd been doing this dance for decades. Engines died one by one, the sudden silence almost as dramatic as their arrival had been.
Jake kicked down his kickstand and pulled off his helmet, running his fingers through gray hair that once had been black as midnight. Around him, his brothers and sister were going through the same ritual, the transition from road warriors to whatever this situation required them to be. "Remember what we talked about," Jake said quietly, his voice carrying the authority that had made him chapter president for the past 8 years. "We're here for the kids. Check the attitudes at the door, keep the language clean, and if anyone wants to start something, we walk away. This isn't about us." Diesel cracked his knuckles, a sound like branches breaking. At 6'6" and built like a linebacker who discovered powerlifting, he was the kind of man who could clear a room just by walking into it. But Jake had seen him cry over a wounded dog on the side of the road, had watched him spend his own money to fix a stranger's broken-down car. "You got it, boss. We're the good guys today." Raven adjusted the small American flag pin on her vest, a gift from her father, a Vietnam veteran who'd never quite understood his daughter's choice of family but had learned to respect it. "We're the good guys always, Diesel. Today, everyone else gets to see it."
As they walked toward the community center, Jake could feel eyes on them from every direction. A group of teenagers had gathered near the corner market, their phones already out, probably live-streaming the arrival of the scary bikers to whatever social media platform was currently consuming their lives. An elderly couple sat on a bench outside the hardware store, the woman clutching her purse a little tighter while the man's face remained carefully neutral. A young mother pushing a stroller crossed to the other side of the street, not bothering to hide her desire to put distance between her child and the approaching leather-clad figures. The automatic doors of the community center whooshed open, and suddenly they were inside a world transformed. The utilitarian space had been decorated with the kind of loving attention that only a community rallying around one of its own could provide. Streamers hung from the ceiling in rainbow colors, and dozens of handmade posters covered the walls, some clearly created by children, with crayon drawings of motorcycles and messages like, "Thank you for helping Emma," and "Bikers are cool." Tables lined the room, laden with casseroles, desserts, and the kind of comfort food that spoke of family recipes passed down through generations. But it was the silence that hit Jake the hardest. Conversations that had been flowing moments before died as surely as if someone had thrown a switch. Heads turned, forks paused halfway to mouths, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. He could practically hear the collective intake of breath as an entire room full of people tried to process the sight of 12 Hell's Angels walking into their community fundraiser. In that moment of suspended animation, Jake saw it all with the clarity that came from years of reading rooms and assessing threats. There was Mrs. Henderson from the Lutheran Church, her face a mask of barely controlled panic as she instinctively stepped closer to her husband. The volunteer firefighters, still in their work clothes, had unconsciously shifted into a defensive formation near the main table. Parents were already calculating distances to exits, hands reaching for children who might not understand why the atmosphere had suddenly changed. And then there was Dr. Sarah Chen, standing near the registration table with a clipboard in her hands and the kind of exhausted determination that Jake recognized from his own mirror on difficult days. She was smaller than he'd expected, maybe 5'3" in her sneakers, with kind eyes that looked like they'd seen too much, but refused to give up hoping for better. Next to her stood a little girl who had to be Emma, bald head covered by a colorful knit cap, but with a smile that could power the entire town. The silence stretched on. Jake felt the weight of the moment settling on his shoulders, the understanding that the next few seconds would determine not just how the evening went, but how his people would be remembered in this place. Tommy Quick Martinez shifted nervously beside him, his hand moving unconsciously toward the chain wallet that hung from his belt, a gesture that Jake recognized as defensive posturing. Raven stood statue still, her dark eyes scanning the room with the kind of tactical awareness that came from years of being the only woman in spaces dominated by testosterone and tradition. Diesel had gone into what Jake privately called gentle giant mode,
his massive frame somehow managing to project harmlessness despite the spiderweb tattoos that covered his neck. But it was Emma who broke the spell. The little girl looked up at her mother with questioning eyes, then back at the group of bikers standing in the doorway like leather-clad apostles of uncertainty. And then, with the kind of fearless innocence that only children possess, she took 3 steps forward and looked up at Jake with a smile that could have melted steel. "Are you motorcycles?" she asked, her voice carrying clearly in the hushed room. "Mom said the motorcycle people were coming to help me raise money for other sick kids. That's really nice." He knelt down slowly, bringing himself to Emma's eye level, aware that every person in the room was watching this interaction with the intensity of people witnessing either a miracle or a catastrophe in progress. "Yes, little lady," he said softly, his voice roughened by decades of cigarettes and highway wind, but gentled by the presence of a child who reminded him so much of his own granddaughter. "We're here to help. That's a beautiful hat you're wearing." Emma touched the knit cap self-consciously, her smile never wavering. "My grandma made it. She makes me a new one every week because she says pretty colors make medicine work better. Do you want to see the motorcycles I drew?"
And just like that, the atmosphere in the room began to change. It wasn't immediate. Trust doesn't work that way, especially when it comes to overcoming years of preconceptions and media-driven fears. But it was a beginning, a crack in the wall of assumptions that had separated 2 worlds that suddenly discovered they might have more in common than anyone had dared to imagine. As Emma chatted excitedly about her artwork, Jake became aware of subtle movements around the room. Dr. Chen had taken a step closer, her medical training overriding her natural caution, as she observed this interaction between her daughter and a man who represented everything she'd been taught to fear. Other parents were starting to relax, their children's natural curiosity beginning to override the adult anxiety that had dominated the room moments before. But Jake also noticed the people who hadn't moved, the ones still standing near the exits, still clutching their belongings a little too tightly, still ready to flee if this situation took a turn for the worse. He understood their caution, respected it even. The Hells Angels hadn't built their reputation on charity work and community service. They'd earned their notoriety through decades of real violence, real criminality, and real reasons for people to be afraid. But as Emma continued to chatter about her drawings, as other children began to peer around their parents' legs with the kind of curiosity that no amount of adult anxiety could completely suppress, Jake felt something he hadn't experienced in years. The possibility that maybe, just maybe, today could be different. The 20 minutes that followed Emma's innocent question felt like 20 hours to Jake Morrison. He found himself sitting cross-legged on the community center floor, surrounded by a growing circle of children who had apparently decided that a Hells Angel chapter president made an acceptable jungle gym. Emma sat directly in front of him, her small hands carefully turning the pages of a photo album filled with her motorcycle drawings, while her voice filled the space between them with the kind of unbridled enthusiasm that only children possess. "This one's my favorite," she said, pointing to a crayon drawing of what appeared to be a motorcycle with wings. "It's a flying bike, like the one I'm going to ride when I get better. My mom says maybe when I'm older, but I think when I'm better is good enough." Jake studied the drawing with the seriousness it deserved, aware that every adult in the room was still watching this interaction with the intensity of people witnessing a nature documentary about predators and prey. The weight of their attention pressed against his shoulders like a physical thing, but Emma's presence somehow made it bearable. There was something about her complete lack of fear, her absolute trust in the goodness of strangers that reminded him of why he'd started riding in the first place. The search for something pure in a world that seemed determined to complicate everything. "That's a beautiful bike," he said softly, his voice carrying the kind of reverence usually reserved for sacred things. "What color is it going to be when you build it for real?" "Purple and gold," Emma said without hesitation. "Purple because it's my favorite color, and gold because that's the color of hope. My mom told me that."
Across the room, Dr. Sarah Chen felt her throat tighten as she watched her daughter interact with a man who, by all logical reasoning, should have terrified both of them. She'd spent her medical career learning to read people quickly and accurately. It was a survival skill in emergency medicine, where split-second decisions could mean the difference between life and death. But Jake Morrison was proving impossible to categorize. The skull and crossbones on his vest said one thing, but the gentle way he handled her daughter's artwork said something entirely different. Sarah had grown up in San Francisco, the daughter of immigrants who had built their American dream through 60-hour work weeks and absolute faith in the power of education. Her parents had sacrificed everything to send her to medical school, had worked double shifts to pay for her residency, had celebrated every milestone in her career as if it were their own personal victory. They taught her to be cautious, to trust but verify, to never let her guard down around people whose intentions weren't immediately clear. But watching Jake with Emma, Sarah found herself remembering something her grandmother had once told her in Mandarin, words that translated roughly to, "Sometimes the fiercest-looking dragons are the ones most afraid of being misunderstood." Her grandmother had been talking about her grandfather, a man whose stern exterior had hidden a heart capable of extraordinary tenderness. Looking at Jake now, Sarah wondered if she was seeing the same phenomenon in reverse. A man whose gentle nature had been wrapped in leather and steel as protection against a world that had taught him to expect the worst. The thought was interrupted by the arrival of Harold Brennan, Millfield's longtime sheriff, whose heavy footsteps announced his presence before he actually appeared in the doorway. Harold was 63 years old, had been wearing a badge for 41 years, and had developed the kind of suspicious nature that came from decades of cleaning up other people's worst moments. He stood in the entrance for a long moment, his hand resting casually on his service weapon, his eyes taking inventory of every Hell's Angel in the room with the methodical precision of someone who had learned never to take chances.
"Afternoon, folks," Harold said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that came naturally to men who had spent their careers standing between order and chaos. "Heard we had some visitors in town. Just thought I'd stop by and make sure everything was going smoothly." The temperature in the room dropped again, not as dramatically as when the bikers had first arrived, but noticeably. Parents unconsciously moved closer to their children. Conversations became more subdued, and the fragile peace that had been building around Emma's innocent acceptance began to feel suddenly precarious. Jake felt the shift immediately. He had been in this situation countless times before. The moment when law enforcement arrived and everyone had to choose sides, when years of mutual suspicion came rushing back like floodwater through a broken dam. He could see it in Harold's stance, in the way the sheriff's eyes never stopped moving, in the careful distance he maintained from the group of bikers who had suddenly gone from community volunteers to potential threats. But he could also see it in the faces of the townspeople, the way they looked between the sheriff and the angels like spectators at a tennis match, waiting to see who would make the first move. And most heartbreakingly, he could see it beginning to dawn on Emma that something was wrong, that the adults around her were tensing up in ways that had nothing to do with her or her fundraiser. "Sheriff Brennan," Jake said carefully, rising slowly from his cross-legged position on the floor. "Jake Morrison, Omaha chapter president. We're here for the fundraiser, sir. Nothing more, nothing less." Harold studied Jake with the kind of gaze that had been perfected in interrogation rooms and traffic stops, a look designed to see through whatever mask a person might be wearing. He'd dealt with bikers before, had arrested more than a few over the years for everything from bar fights to drug trafficking, but he'd also been doing this job long enough to recognize the difference between a man looking for trouble and a man trying to avoid it. "I can see that," Harold said finally, his tone remaining carefully neutral. "Dr. Chen mentioned you folks had volunteered to help with the event. That's, commendable." The word hung in the air like a question mark, neither quite approval nor condemnation, but something suspended uncomfortably between the two. Jake understood the position the sheriff was in. Harold had a responsibility to protect his community, and that meant being suspicious of people whose reputation preceded them like storm clouds. But Jake also understood that this moment would define not just the rest of the evening, but potentially the relationship between his club and this community for years to come. "Sheriff," said a voice from across the room, and everyone turned to see Walter Kozlowski, rising from one of the folding chairs near the dessert table. At 74, Walter moved with the careful deliberation of a man whose body had been worn down by 7 decades of manual labor. But his voice still carried the strength that had made him one of the most respected farmers in 3 counties. He had been born on the land his family still worked, had buried both his parents in the cemetery just outside town, had raised 5 children and seen them scattered to the winds in search of opportunities that no longer existed in places like Millfield. He'd survived the farm crisis of the 1980s, had weathered droughts and floods and market crashes that had broken stronger men. His hands were gnarled from arthritis and countless injuries, his back permanently bent from years of heavy lifting, but his eyes were still clear and sharp and kind. "These folks came here to help a sick little girl," Walter continued, his voice carrying the kind of authority that came not from a badge or a title, but from a lifetime of being someone his neighbors could count on. "Seems to me that makes them neighbors, at least for today." The room fell silent again, but this silence felt different from the others, less charged with fear and more weighted with consideration. Harold's hand moved away from his weapon, not dramatically, but noticeably enough that some of the tension began to ease from the shoulders around the room. Emma, who had been watching this adult drama unfold with the kind of confused concern that children feel when the grown-ups start acting strangely, suddenly stood up and walked over to where Walter was sitting. She took his weathered hand in both of her small ones and looked up at him with eyes that seemed older than her 8 years. "Mr. Walter," she said, her voice carrying clearly in the quiet room, "are you afraid of the motorcycle people too?" Walter looked down at her with the kind of gentle smile that grandfathers reserve for questions that cut straight to the heart of things adults prefer to dance around. "No, sweetheart," he said, softly. "I'm not afraid. Sometimes grown-ups just need a little time to figure out who's family and who's not." The word family seemed to resonate through the room like a stone dropped into still water, creating ripples that touched everyone present. Jake felt something tighten in his chest as he realized that this elderly farmer had somehow managed to articulate what he had been struggling to express, that family wasn't always about blood, that sometimes it was about showing up when someone needed help, that community could extend beyond the boundaries that society tried to impose.
Raven, who had been standing near the back of the room with her arms crossed defensively across her chest, felt her posture soften slightly. She'd grown up in foster care, had bounced between families who saw her as either a paycheck or a problem, had learned early that belonging was something you had to fight for, rather than something that was freely given. The Angels had been the first group to accept her completely, to see past the anger and the attitude to the scared kid underneath. But she'd never allowed herself to hope that acceptance might extend beyond the brotherhood, that people like Walter might be willing to see her as something other than a threat. Tommy, Quick Martinez, was struggling with his own demons as he watched the interaction between Walter and Emma. At 25, he was the newest member of the chapter, had earned his colors only 6 months earlier after a prospect period that had tested every limit he thought he had. He joined the Angels for the same reason most young men did, because he was looking for something to believe in, something bigger than the dead-end job at the auto parts store and the cramped apartment he shared with 2 other guys who spent their days playing video games and their nights getting high. But Tommy carried baggage that even his brothers in the club didn't fully understand. His younger sister had died of brain cancer when she was 9 and he was 17. He'd watched her fade away in hospital rooms that smelled like disinfectant and false hope, had held her hand during chemotherapy sessions that made her so sick she could barely lift her head. The doctors had done everything they could. His parents had mortgaged their house and sold everything they owned to pay for treatments that ultimately proved useless. And in the end, Maria had died anyway, leaving behind a family broken by grief and debt. Looking at Emma now,
Seeing her bright smile and her colorful hat and her absolute faith that the adults around her would somehow make everything okay, Tommy felt like he was being torn apart from the inside. Part of him wanted to scoop her up and protect her from everything that was coming, wanted to build a wall around her that would keep out all the pain and disappointment and loss that he knew were waiting somewhere in her future. But another part of him, the part that had never properly grieved his sister's death, wanted to run from this room and never look back, wanted to escape the memories that Emma's presence was dragging up from the places where he'd buried them. Diesel, meanwhile, was dealing with his own complicated relationship with authority as he watched Sheriff Brennan assess the situation. At 41, he'd spent more time in prison than most people spent in college. Drug charges, assault charges, and one memorable incident involving a bar fight that required 6 officers and a taser to resolve. He'd learned to expect the worst from cops, had developed an instinctive defensive posture whenever he saw a badge, had built his life around the assumption that law enforcement would always see him as a criminal first and a human being second. But there was something different about Harold Brennan, something in the way the sheriff was taking his time to assess the situation rather than making immediate assumptions. Harold had learned to read cops the way other people read weather patterns. It was a survival skill that had kept him out of trouble more than once. Most officers would have come in hard, would have started running names and looking for reasons to escalate the situation. Harold was being cautious, yes, but he was also being respectful, treating the angels like potential allies rather than automatic enemies. The realization was unsettling in ways that Diesel wasn't prepared to examine too closely. He'd built his identity around being the kind of man that polite society rejected, and found purpose in standing outside the boundaries of respectability and conventional morality. But if Sheriff Brennan was willing to give them the benefit of the doubt, if Walter Kozlowski was ready to call them neighbors, what did that mean for the carefully constructed worldview that had sustained him through 4 decades of feeling like an outsider? Dr. Emma Chen was watching all of this unfold with the kind of clinical detachment that had served her well in emergency rooms, but she was also feeling emotions that had nothing to do with medical training. Emma's cancer diagnosis had shattered every assumption she'd held about fairness and justice and the way the world was supposed to work. Children weren't supposed to get cancer. Parents weren't supposed to have to choose between bankruptcy and their child's life. And 8-year-olds weren't supposed to have to be braver than most adults ever managed to be. The fundraiser had been her attempt to impose some kind of order on the chaos, to create meaning out of suffering by helping other families avoid the financial devastation that had nearly destroyed her own. But she'd never imagined that help would come from people like Jake Morrison and his leather-clad family, had never considered that angels might arrive wearing the colors of an organization she'd been taught to fear. Watching Jake interact with Emma, seeing the genuine tenderness in his weathered features, Sarah felt something shifting in her understanding of the world. She'd spent her career categorizing people, patients and family members, colleagues and administrators, people who could help and people who might hurt. But Jake seemed to exist in some liminal space between categories, challenging her assumptions about who could be trusted and who should be feared.
The moment stretched on, filled with the kind of pregnant possibility that comes when people realize they're standing at a crossroads where every choice will have consequences that extend far beyond the immediate situation. Emma continued to hold Walter's hand, her small fingers intertwined with his gnarled ones, creating a bridge between generations and worldviews that seemed to embody everything the fundraiser was meant to represent. Sheriff Brennan finally broke the silence by taking a deliberate step back, a gesture that somehow managed to convey both continued vigilance and grudging acceptance. "Well," he said, his tone carefully neutral, "I suppose I should let you folks get back to your event. Emma, you make sure these visitors know where to find the best desserts, okay?" Emma's face lit up with a smile that could have powered the entire town. "Sheriff Harold, did you try Mrs. Patterson's apple pie? It's the best in the whole world, and she made 3 of them just for tonight." As Emma began chattering excitedly about the various food offerings, Jake felt some of the tension in his shoulders begin to ease.
It wasn't complete acceptance. He could still see the wariness in some faces, still feel the weight of decades of suspicion and stereotypes hanging in the air like smoke. But it was a beginning, a crack in the wall that separated their two worlds, and sometimes that was enough. The next 2 hours unfolded with the kind of careful choreography that happens when people who don't trust each other are determined to find common ground. The bikers mingled with the townspeople, their conversations stilted at first, but gradually becoming more natural as shared stories about children and community began to bridge the gaps that leather vests and skull logos had created. Raven found herself in an extended conversation with Margaret Patterson, the elderly woman who had made the famous apple pies, about the challenges of being a woman in male-dominated environments. Margaret had been one of the first female school principals in the county, had spent 30 years breaking down barriers and fighting for respect in ways that Raven recognized and appreciated. By the end of their talk, Raven had Margaret's recipe for apple pie and an invitation to stop by whenever she was in the area. Diesel ended up helping move tables and chairs, his massive frame making quick work of tasks that would have required 3 normal-sized men. The volunteer firefighters, initially suspicious of his size and his tattoos, gradually warmed to him as they realized he was just another guy who liked to be useful. By the time they were setting up for the evening's auction, they were trading stories about the best ways to lift heavy objects without throwing out your back. Tommy struggled more than the others, his emotions swinging wildly between the desire to connect with Emma and the need to protect himself from the memories her presence triggered. He found refuge in helping Sarah organize the silent auction items, focusing on the mechanics of arranging bid sheets and price tags rather than the deeper implications of what they were all doing there. But it was Jake who found himself most challenged by the evening's events, not because of external conflict, but because of the internal war being waged between the man he'd become and the man he'd once hoped to be. Sitting on that community center floor with Emma, listening to her talk about flying motorcycles and colors of hope, he'd felt something stirring in his chest that he'd thought was dead and buried. The possibility of redemption, the chance to be seen as something other than a symbol of rebellion and danger. As the evening wore on and the fundraiser began to show signs of real success, with donation jars filling up and auction bids climbing higher than anyone had dared to hope, Jake found himself thinking about choices and consequences, about the weight of reputation and the possibility of second chances. He thought about his granddaughter Lily, about the world he was leaving for her, about whether it was possible to be both a Hell's Angel and a force for good in communities like Millfield. The struggle wasn't just personal, it was existential, challenging everything he thought he understood about identity and belonging and the roles that people like him were allowed to play in the larger story of the American community. But as he watched Emma continue to work her magic on everyone around her, as he saw barriers falling and connections forming that seemed impossible just hours earlier, Jake began to wonder if maybe, just maybe, there was room in this world for dragons who had learned to be gentle.
12 motorcycles, maybe 15, coming in hard from the east. Not Harleys, the engines were too high-pitched, too modern. Sport bikes, probably, the kind favored by younger riders who valued speed over tradition and had something to prove to anyone willing to listen. Jake's stomach tightened as he recognized the particular cadence of riders who weren't coming to help with a charity fundraiser. "Diesel?" he called softly, not wanting to alarm the civilians but needing to alert his crew. "We got company coming." Diesel's massive head turned toward the windows, his expression shifting from relaxed enjoyment to the kind of hypervigilance that had kept him alive through 4 decades of dangerous situations. Around the room, the other angels began to move with subtle but unmistakable purpose, their bodies unconsciously arranging themselves into defensive positions while their faces maintained the careful neutrality that came from years of practice. The sound grew louder, more aggressive, and suddenly the conversations in the community center began to falter as even the civilians recognized that something was changing. Parents instinctively moved closer to their children. Volunteers paused in their auction preparations, and Sheriff Brennan's hand drifted back toward his service weapon with the kind of muscle memory that spoke of too many nights when peaceful situations had turned deadly without warning. Through the front windows, they could see the approaching motorcycles now, a convoy of sport bikes ridden by young men whose body language radiated hostility and territorial aggression. They wore no colors, claimed no club affiliation, but Jake recognized the type immediately. These were local riders, probably from Omaha or Lincoln, who had heard about the Hells Angels' presence in Millfield and decided that this represented some kind of challenge to their authority, some invasion of their territory that required a response. The lead rider was a kid who couldn't have been more than 25 years old, his face hidden behind a black helmet, but his posture screaming defiance in barely controlled violence. He gunned his engine as he approached the community center, the sound echoing off the brick buildings like thunder in a canyon, and Jake could see him scanning the parking lot where the Angels' Harleys sat in their neat formation. "Jake?" Raven said quietly, moving to his side with the fluid grace that had made her one of the most respected fighters in the club. "These boys look like they're hunting for trouble." "I can see that," Jake replied, his voice carrying the kind of calm authority that came from 3 decades of dealing with situations exactly like this one. "The question is whether we give them what they're looking for or find another way to handle this." The sport bikes pulled into the parking lot with theatrical precision, their riders revving engines and positioning their machines in a semicircle that effectively blocked the main exit. It was a classic intimidation tactic designed to trap their targets and demonstrate dominance through superior numbers and aggressive positioning. The lead rider killed his engine and pulled off his helmet, revealing a face that was young and angry and absolutely convinced of its own righteousness. His name was Marcus Blade Rodriguez, though he'd earned that nickname more for his mouth than for any actual weapon skills. And at 24, he was the self-appointed leader of a loose confederation of sport bike riders who called themselves the Night Wolves. They weren't a real motorcycle club in any traditional sense. They had no colors, no formal structure, no code beyond the basic principle that disrespect demanded a response. But they were local, they were numerous, and they had decided that the presence of the Hells Angels in their territory was an insult that couldn't be allowed to stand. Marcus had grown up poor in North Omaha, had spent his teenage years bouncing between juvenile detention centers and group homes, had learned early that respect was something you took rather than something you earned. The sport bike had been his ticket out of the neighborhood, his entry into a world where speed and attitude could compensate for the lack of everything else. He had built his reputation on street racing and bar fights, on being willing to go further than anyone else when confrontations turned physical. But Marcus had never actually faced real bikers before, had never stood toe-to-toe with men whose reputations were built on something more substantial than YouTube videos and weekend rides. Looking across the parking lot at the Hells Angels bikes, seeing the Death's Head logos and the battle scars that spoke of decades on the road, he felt his first twinge of uncertainty. But it was too late to back down now. He had brought 14 other riders with him, had talked a big game about showing these old-timers who really ran the streets, and his reputation depended on following through. Inside the community center, the atmosphere had shifted dramatically. The tentative warmth that had been building between the Angels and the townspeople evaporated like morning mist, replaced by the kind of electric tension that precedes violence. Parents began herding their children toward the back of the building. Volunteers abandoned their auction preparations, and Sheriff Brennan's hand drifted back toward his service weapon with the kind of muscle memory that spoke of too many nights when peaceful situations had turned deadly without warning. Dr. Emma Chen felt her medical training kick in as she automatically began assessing the situation from a triage perspective. 15 young men on motorcycles, aggressive body language, obvious territorial challenge to the established bikers. This had all the makings of the kind of situation that filled emergency rooms with trauma cases. She found herself unconsciously moving toward Emma, her maternal instincts overriding her professional detachment as she calculated distances to exits and considered whether the community center's brick walls would provide adequate protection if this escalated to actual violence.
Emma, however, seemed oblivious to the adult anxiety surrounding her. She was still clutching her art collection, still chattering excitedly about her drawings, apparently unaware that the friendly atmosphere of her fundraiser was rapidly dissolving into something potentially dangerous. "Look, Mr. Jake," she said, tugging on his leather vest, "I drew a picture of your motorcycle, too. It's the big one with the pretty eagle on the side." Jake felt his heart constrict as he looked down at Emma's innocent face, at her complete trust that the adults around her would keep her safe, at her absolute inability to comprehend that her charity event might become the backdrop for the kind of violence that had defined too much of his life.
In that moment, he made a decision that would have consequences far beyond anything he could have imagined. "Raven," he said quietly, "take Emma and her mother to the back room. Get all the civilians away from the windows. This is about to get ugly." "Jake, we don't have to do this," Raven replied, her voice carrying the kind of urgent reasoning that came from someone who had seen too many unnecessary fights escalate beyond all proportion. "These are just kids playing dress-up. We can walk away." "Can we?" Jake asked, his eyes never leaving the young men in the parking lot who were now dismounting their bikes and moving toward the community center with the kind of swaggering confidence that spoke of imminent confrontation. "Look around, Raven. Look at these people. We came here to help, and now we've brought trouble right to their door. These folks trusted us enough to let us into their lives, and now they're about to pay the price for that trust." Sheriff Brennan had moved to the front of the room, his hand now openly resting on his weapon, his radio crackling with static as he called for backup that might or might not arrive in time to prevent whatever was about to happen. "Mr. Morrison," he said, his voice carrying the kind of professional calm that law enforcement officers learn to project even when their hearts are racing, "I'm going to need you and your people to stay exactly where you are while I handle this situation. With all due respect, Sheriff, these boys didn't come here looking for you. They came looking for us, and the last thing any of us wants is for innocent people to get caught in the crossfire." The front doors of the community center burst open with enough force to rattle the windows, and Marcus Rodriguez strode into the room like he owned it, his 14 companions spreading out behind him in a formation designed to maximize intimidation. They were all young, all angry, and all absolutely convinced that they were about to teach the famous Hells Angels a lesson about respect and territory. "Well, well," Marcus said, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent room with the kind of theatrical menace that came more from watching too many movies than from actual experience with violence. "Look what we got here, the big bad Hells Angels playing dress-up at a kiddie party. What's next, boys? Gonna start selling cookies door to door?" The insult hung in the air like a challenge flag, and Jake felt every eye in the room turned toward him, waiting to see how the legendary Hells Angels would respond to such blatant disrespect. He could feel his brothers tensing behind him, could sense Diesel's massive frame coiling like a spring, could see Tommy's hand moving unconsciously toward the chain that hung from his belt. The moment balanced on a knife's edge, with violence and restraint separated by nothing more than his next words. "Son," he said quietly, his voice carrying the kind of weary authority that came from 3 decades of dealing with young men who confused aggression with courage. "You're making a mistake. We're not here for trouble. We're here to help a sick little girl raise money for other sick children. That's it. Nothing more, nothing less." Marcus laughed, a sound devoid of humor or warmth. "Oh, that's rich. The mighty Hells Angels reduced to charity work. What happened, old man? The club get too soft for real outlaw work?" The second insult was worse than the first, not just because it questioned Jake's courage, but because it struck at the heart of everything the Angels represented. To suggest that helping sick children was somehow beneath them, that charity was a sign of weakness rather than strength, revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of what the club had become in its better moments. But it was Walter Kozlowski who responded first, rising slowly from his chair near the dessert table with the kind of deliberate dignity that comes from 70 years of standing up for what's right. "Young man, these folks came here to help our community. They've been nothing but respectful and generous since they arrived. I suggest you show them the same courtesy."
Marcus turned toward Walter with a sneer that transformed his youthful features into something ugly and predatory. "And I suggest you mind your own business, old man, before you get hurt. This is between us and the has-been bikers." The threat against Walter galvanized the room in ways that the insults to the Angels hadn't. This was their neighbor, their friend,
a man who had given his life to this community and earned the right to speak without fear of intimidation. Several of the volunteer firefighters moved forward instinctively, their faces showing the kind of protective anger that comes when someone threatens family. But it was Emma who broke the standoff, her small voice cutting through the tension like a knife through silk. "Why are you being mean?" she asked, looking up at Marcus with the kind of confused hurt that only children can express with such devastating honesty. "We're just trying to help sick kids. That's a good thing. Why don't you want to help sick kids?" Marcus looked down at Emma with obvious surprise, clearly not having expected to find children at what he'd assumed would be a straightforward territorial confrontation. For a moment, his aggressive facade wavered, revealing the confused young man beneath the carefully constructed outlaw persona. But then his friends shifted behind him, their body language radiating the kind of peer pressure that demanded he maintain his dominant position regardless of the circumstances. "Look, kid," he said, his voice losing some of its edge but retaining its fundamental hardness. "Sometimes grown-ups have business to settle. This isn't about you or your little fundraiser. This is about respect and territory and things you wouldn't understand." "I understand that you're scaring people," Emma replied with the kind of direct honesty that only children can express with such devastating honesty. "And I understand that scared people can't help sick kids, so maybe you should stop being scary and start being helpful instead." The simplicity of her logic hit the room like a physical blow, reducing a complex territorial dispute to its most basic elements. People were afraid, children needed help, and fear was preventing help from being given. It was the kind of moral clarity that adults spent their lives trying to complicate, and coming from an 8-year-old cancer survivor, it carried the weight of absolute truth. Marcus felt something shift inside his chest, a crack in the armor of anger and resentment that had driven him to this confrontation, but he'd come too far to back down now, had brought too many witnesses to his challenge, had invested too much of his reputation in proving that the Night Wolves weren't afraid of anyone, including the legendary Hells Angels. "This isn't about your fundraiser, kid," he said, his voice hardening again as he turned his attention back to Jake. "This is about these old-timers thinking they can ride into our territory without permission, without paying proper respects to the people who actually run these streets." "Your territory?" Jake asked, his voice carrying a note of genuine curiosity rather than challenge. "Son, how long have you been riding? How many miles you got on that bike? How many years have you been paying dues to the road?" The questions hit Marcus like physical blows, exposing the fundamental weakness in his position. He'd been riding for 3 years, had maybe 15,000 miles on his current bike, had never been part of anything bigger than weekend rides to local bike nights. The Hells Angels had been riding these roads since before he was born, had earned their place through decades of commitment and sacrifice that he couldn't begin to understand. "Don't matter how long I've been riding," Marcus replied, but his voice carried less conviction now, the certainty beginning to drain out of his posture like air from a punctured tire. "What matters is that you're here now, in our backyard, acting like you own the place. We're here because a doctor asked for help. We're here because a little girl is fighting cancer, and other families are going bankrupt trying to save their children. We're here because sometimes being an outlaw means standing up for people who can't stand up for themselves." The words hung in the air between them, challenging everything Marcus thought he understood about what it meant to be a real biker, what it meant to be an outlaw, what it meant to command respect. He'd spent years building his identity around the idea that strength came from taking what you wanted, that respect was earned through intimidation and violence. But Jake was suggesting something different, something that Marcus didn't have the life experience to fully comprehend. Behind Marcus, his followers were beginning to shift restlessly, their own certainty wavering as they realized that this confrontation wasn't unfolding the way they had expected. They had come to expect to find stereotypical outlaw bikers, men whose response to challenge would be immediate and violent. Instead, they had found something more complex, more nuanced, and infinitely more difficult to categorize.
But Marcus had gone too far to retreat now, had invested too much of his reputation in this moment to back down gracefully. "Pretty words, old man," he said, his voice carrying a desperate edge as he tried to salvage his dominance. "But words don't mean nothing without action. You want to play hero in our territory? You're going to have to go through us first." The challenge was unmistakable now, the line drawn in the sand with the kind of finality that made violence seem inevitable. Jake felt the weight of decision settling on his shoulders like a lead blanket, the understanding that his next words would determine not just the outcome of this confrontation, but the safety of everyone in the room. Around him, his brothers waited for his signal, their loyalty absolute and the willingness to follow him into violence unquestioned. Behind him, the townspeople of Millfield watched with the kind of terrified fascination that comes from witnessing events that will be talked about for decades. And in front of him, a young man who didn't understand the consequences of his actions continued to push toward a confrontation that could destroy everything they'd worked to build that evening. The moment stretched on, pregnant with possibility and heavy with the weight of choices that couldn't be undone. In that silence, Jake Morrison found himself thinking about Emma's drawings of flying motorcycles, about Walter Kozlowski's weathered hands and unwavering dignity, about the tentative bridges that had been built between two worlds that had spent decades viewing each other with suspicion and fear. He thought about his granddaughter Lily, about the world he wanted to leave for her, about whether it was possible to be both a Hell's Angel and a force for peace in communities like Millfield. He thought about the weight of reputation and the price of respect, about the difference between being feared and being trusted, about the possibility that sometimes the most rebellious thing an outlaw could do was refuse to fight. The resolution of the Marcus confrontation, where he apologizes and shakes hands with Jake, end the story there with a simple conclusion about the fundraiser's success. And Harold Brennan stepped inside with backup that nobody had expected. Not other deputies, not state police, not the kind of law enforcement presence that typically responded to biker confrontations. Instead, Harold was accompanied by 6 of the largest, most imposing men any of them had ever seen, all wearing leather vests, all carrying themselves with the kind of quiet authority that spoke of real experience with real violence. These weren't weekend warriors or wannabe outlaws. These were legitimate bikers, members of clubs whose reputations had been earned through decades of commitment to the code that governed the outlaw motorcycle world. The lead rider was a man who looked to be in his 60s, his gray beard braided with leather strips, his arms covered with tattoos that told the story of a life lived outside the boundaries of conventional society. He moved with the kind of careful precision that comes from knowing that every step might be your last. And when he spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone who had earned his place through blood and sacrifice. "Afternoon, Jake," he said, nodding toward the Hells Angels president with the kind of respectful recognition that spoke of shared history and mutual understanding. "Heard you boys were in town helping with a charity event. Thought we'd stop by and see if you needed any assistance." Jake felt his heart rate slow for the first time since the confrontation began, recognizing not just Dutch Haymaker, but the implications of his presence. This was Dutch Haymaker, president of the Iron Resurrection MC, one of the most respected clubs in the Midwest. Dutch's appearance wasn't coincidental. Word had spread through the biker community about the Angels' charity work, and the old-timers had come to show their support. But more importantly, Dutch's presence changed the entire dynamic of the confrontation. Marcus and his Nightwolves might have been willing to challenge 12 Hells Angels, might have convinced themselves that youth and numbers could overcome experience and reputation. But facing 18 legitimate bikers, including 2 club presidents whose combined experience represented more than a century of outlaw life, was an entirely different proposition. Marcus felt his confidence evaporating like water on hot asphalt as he took in the new arrivals.
recognizing in their weathered faces and confident bearing the kind of authentic outlaw presence that he'd been trying to emulate but had never truly understood. These weren't men playing at being dangerous. These were men who had lived through decades of real danger and emerged stronger for the experience. "Dutch," he replied, his voice carrying genuine warmth despite the tension of the situation. "Good to see you, brother. We were just explaining to these young men that we're here for a charity fundraiser, nothing more." Dutch nodded slowly, his eyes moving from Jake to Marcus and back again, with the kind of careful assessment that came from decades of reading dangerous situations. "That's what I heard. Also heard that some folks might have gotten the wrong idea about your intentions." The understatement hum in the air like a diplomatic olive branch, offering Marcus and his crew a way to back down without losing too much face. It was the kind of graceful exit strategy that experienced bikers learned to provide for younger riders who had gotten in over their heads.
But Marcus was too young, too proud, and too committed to his confrontational approach to recognize the gift he was being offered. Instead, he interpreted Dutch's diplomatic language as condescension, as further evidence that the old-timers thought he and his crew were beneath their notice. "We didn't get any wrong ideas," Marcus said, his voice carrying a desperate edge as he realized that the situation had shifted beyond his control. "We know exactly what's going on here. These angels think they can ride into our territory whenever they want, act like they own the place, intimidate honest people trying to go about their business." The accusation was so far from reality that several people in the room actually gasped, the sound carrying clearly in the sudden silence that followed Marcus's words. Emma's mother moved protectively closer to her daughter. Walter Kozlowski shook his head in obvious disbelief, and even some of Marcus's own crew shifted uncomfortably as they realized that their leader had just accused the very people who had been nothing but respectful of intimidating the townspeople. Dutch's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes grew noticeably colder as he processed Marcus's words. In the outlaw motorcycle world, false accusations were taken seriously, particularly when they involved questions of honor and respect. To suggest that the angels had been intimidating civilians was not just factually incorrect, it was a direct challenge to their reputation and their integrity. "Son," Dutch said, his voice carrying the kind of calm authority that made smart people pay attention, "I think you might want to reconsider your position here. From what I can see, these folks have been nothing but respectful to your community. Maybe you ought to show them the same courtesy." But Marcus had passed the point of rational decision-making, had invested too much of his identity in this confrontation to back down gracefully. The arrival of additional bikers hadn't intimidated him, it had trapped him, making retreat seem cowardice rather than wisdom. In his mind, he had two choices: fight or be forever branded as someone who talked big but backed down when confronted with real opposition. "Courtesy?" Marcus laughed, the sound harsh and brittle in the tense atmosphere of the community center. "You want to talk about courtesy? How about the courtesy of asking permission before you ride into someone else's territory? How about the courtesy of showing proper respect to the people who actually live here?" The second accusation was even more inflammatory than the first, suggesting that the angels had violated the unwritten codes that govern territorial boundaries between motorcycle clubs. But Marcus had made a critical error in his understanding of those codes. They applied to clubs, not to random groups of sport bike riders who had no formal structure or recognition within the outlaw motorcycle community. Jake felt his patience finally beginning to wear thin as he realized that Marcus was either too inexperienced or too stubborn to understand the situation he'd created. The young man wasn't just challenging the angels' right to be in Millfield. He was questioning their integrity, their honor, and their commitment to the very values that had brought them to the fundraiser in the first place. "Listen carefully, son," Jake said, his voice carrying the kind of calm authority that came from 30 decades of dealing with situations exactly like this one. "We're here because a doctor asked for our help. We're here because sick children need money for treatment. We're here because sometimes being an outlaw means standing up for people who can't stand up for themselves.
If you've got a problem with that, we can settle it outside. But we're not going to let you threaten these good people or disrupt this fundraiser." The gauntlet had been thrown down, the challenge issued with the kind of finality that made violence seem inevitable. Around the room, people began moving toward exits, parents scooping up children, volunteers abandoning their posts as they realized that the tentative peace of the evening was about to shatter like glass. But it was Emma who once again changed the trajectory of events, her small voice cutting through the testosterone-fueled confrontation like a beacon of sanity in a world gone temporarily mad. "Stop it," she said, her voice carrying with surprising force for such a small person. "Just stop it right now. This is my fundraiser, and I don't want anyone fighting at my fundraiser." The authority in her voice was absolute, the moral weight of her position unassailable. This was her event, her community, her fight against cancer that had brought everyone together. To continue the confrontation in the face of her direct plea would be to ignore the very person they all claimed to be protecting.
Marcus looked down at Emma with obvious confusion, clearly struggling to reconcile his aggressive intentions with the presence of a sick child whose fundraiser he was disrupting. For the first time since entering the community center, he seemed to see the situation clearly. The decorations, the donation jars, the auction items, the families who had come together to help one of their own. "Kid, he began, but Emma wasn't finished. "You came here being mean and scary," she continued, her 8-year-old voice carrying the kind of moral clarity that adults spent their lives trying to achieve. "But Mr. Jake and his friends came here to help sick kids like me. So which one of you is really the good guy?" The question hung in the air like a sword of Damocles, cutting through all the posturing and territorial disputes to reach the fundamental truth of the situation. Marcus had positioned himself as the defender of his community, but Emma was that community, and she was making it clear which group had actually earned her trust and gratitude. Emma's question hung in the air like a church bell tolling, its simple truth reverberating through the community center with enough force to stop a war. Marcus Rodriguez stood frozen in the sudden silence, his carefully constructed bravado crumbling as he found himself unable to answer a question posed by an 8-year-old cancer survivor whose only crime had been believing that adults were fundamentally good. For 30 seconds that felt like 30 minutes, nobody moved. The night wolves shifted restlessly behind their leader, their own certainty beginning to evaporate as they realized that their territorial challenge had devolved into something that made them look like bullies threatening sick children. The townspeople watched with bated breath, sensing that they were witnessing a moment that would define not just the evening, but their understanding of human nature itself. It was Walter Kozlowski who finally broke the silence, rising from his chair with the deliberate dignity of a man who had spent 70 years learning when words mattered most. His weathered hands gripped his cane, not because he needed it for support, but because it had belonged to his father, and his father before him, a tangible connection to generations of men who had stood up for what was right when it mattered most. "Son," Walter said, addressing Marcus directly but speaking loud enough for everyone in the room to hear, "I think there's some things you need to know about the men you're challenging." Marcus turned toward the elderly farmer with obvious irritation, his face flushed with the kind of embarrassment that comes from being morally outmaneuvered by a child. "Oh man, this ain't your business. This is between us and them." "Everything that happens in this community is my business," Walter replied with quiet authority. "I've been farming this land for 53 years, have buried my parents and my wife in the cemetery just outside town, have watched this place grow and struggle and endure through good times and bad. And in all those years, I've learned to recognize the difference between men who bring trouble and men who face it." He paused, his eyes moving from Marcus to Jake and back again, as if weighing something in his mind that others couldn't see. "You want to know who Jake Morrison really is? You want to understand what you're really challenging here?" Jake felt a familiar tightness in his chest, the instinctive defensiveness that came whenever someone threatened to expose the parts of his life he preferred to keep private. He learned long ago that reputation was both a shield and weapon, that mystery often served him better than truth,
that people's assumptions about the Hells Angels could be more useful than their knowledge. "Walter," he said quietly, "you don't need to—" "Yes, I do," Walter interrupted, his voice carrying the kind of gentle firmness that came from men who had raised children and buried dreams and learned that some truths were too important to keep buried. 15 years ago, he began, my grandson Michael was diagnosed with acute lymphocytic leukemia. He was 6 years old, same age as my youngest granddaughter is now, and the doctors at Children's Hospital said he needed treatment that our insurance wouldn't cover. Experimental therapy, they called it. Might work, might not, but it was his only chance.
Jake closed his eyes, knowing where this story was heading, knowing that Walter was about to share something that would strip away the carefully maintained mystery that had protected him for years. Around him, he could feel his brothers shifting uncomfortably, understanding that their president was about to be exposed in ways that went against everything the club stood for. The treatment cost $400,000, Walter continued, his voice steady despite the obvious emotion behind the words. We mortgaged the farm, sold everything we could, started a fundraising campaign that raised maybe $30,000. It wasn't nearly enough, and time was running out. Dr. Sarah Chen felt her breath catch as she realized that Walter's story was uncomfortably similar to her own, that the elderly farmer had walked the same nightmare path that had brought her to organize Emma's fundraiser. She found herself moving closer to her daughter, instinctively seeking the comfort of physical contact with the person who had taught her that love was stronger than fear. I was at my wit's end, Walter said, his eyes finding Jake's across the room. Sitting in that hospital waiting room, watching my grandson get sicker while I tried to figure out how to find money that didn't exist. That's when this man walked in. He gestured toward Jake with his cane, the simple movement carrying more weight than any dramatic flourish could have achieved. Didn't know who he was, didn't care about the leather vest or the patches or the reputation. All I saw was a stranger who asked me why I looked like the world was ending. Marcus felt something cold settling in his stomach as he began to understand where the story was leading. The Nightwolves had come here expecting to confront stereotypical outlaw bikers, men whose response to challenge would be immediate and violent. Instead, they were about to learn something that would complicate their understanding of who deserved respect and who deserved challenge. I told him about Michael, Walter continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. Told him about the money we needed, about the treatment that might save my grandson's life. And you know what this man did? This dangerous Hell's Angel that y'all seem so afraid of? The question hung in the air for a moment before Walter answered it himself, his words carrying the weight of absolute truth. He wrote a check. Right there in that hospital waiting room, he wrote a personal check for the full amount, $400,000. No publicity, no recognition, no expectation of anything in return. Just one human being helping another because it was the right thing to do. The revelation hit the room like a physical blow, shattering assumptions and preconceptions with the force of simple truth. Marcus felt his worldview tilting on its axis as he tried to reconcile this information with everything he thought he knew about outlaw bikers and their motivations. But that's not the end of the story, Walter said, his eyes never leaving Jake's face. Because when I tried to thank him, when I tried to find some way to repay him, he told me something I've never forgotten. He said, "The only way you can repay me is by helping the next family that needs it." Jake felt exposed in ways that went beyond physical vulnerability, as if Walter's words had stripped away not just his carefully maintained privacy, but the protective armor that had allowed him to function in a world that demanded toughness above all else.
He'd spent 3 decades building a reputation based on fear and respect, and now an elderly farmer was revealing the parts of his character that didn't fit the outlaw narrative. Michael is 21 now. He's studying to be a teacher, wants to work with kids who are fighting the same battles he won. And every year, on the anniversary of his remission, he volunteers at the children's hospital, reading the kids who are going through what he went through. Emma had been listening to Walter's story with the kind of rapt attention that children reserve for tales that speak to their deepest understanding of fairness and justice. When he finished, she looked up at Jake with eyes that seemed older than her 8 years, as if Walter's revelation had confirmed something she'd sensed but couldn't articulate. "You saved a little boy," she said simply, her voice carrying across the silent room with perfect clarity. "You saved a little boy, just like people are trying to save me." Jake knelt down slowly, bringing himself to Emma's eye level, aware that every person in the room was watching this interaction with the intensity of people witnessing something sacred. "We all save each other, little lady. That's what family does, even when family includes people we've never met before." The word family seemed to resonate through the room like a tuning fork, creating harmonics that touched everyone present in different ways. "I know this is getting intense, but trust me, you need to stick with this story for 3 more minutes to see the incredible transformation that happens next. Hit that share button if you're loving this journey, and let me know in the comments what family means to you. For the townspeople of Millfield, it redefined their understanding of who could be trusted with their community's well-being. For the Angels, it articulated something they'd always known but rarely spoke aloud, that their brotherhood extended beyond club colors to encompass anyone who needed protection or help.
But for Marcus Rodriguez and his Nightwolves, Walter's revelation created a crisis of identity that struck at the heart of everything they thought they understood about strength and respect, and what it meant to be a real outlaw. Marcus had built his self-image around the idea that he was tougher than the establishment, more authentic than the weekend warriors, more committed to the outlaw lifestyle than the old-timers who had supposedly gone soft. But Jake Morrison's quiet generosity exposed the fundamental shallowness of that worldview, revealing that real strength sometimes meant helping rather than hurting, that authentic outlaws sometimes wrote checks instead of throwing punches. That's not, Marcus stammered, his voice betraying the confusion and uncertainty that was rapidly replacing his earlier aggression. "I mean, that doesn't change. You're still what?" asked Dutch Hammaker, his voice carrying the kind of patient curiosity that came from men who had spent decades watching young riders struggle to understand concepts that couldn't be learned from movies or YouTube videos. "Still dangerous? Still outlaws? Still committed to a code that you don't understand?" The questions hit Marcus like physical blows, forcing him to confront the reality that his understanding of outlaw culture was based more on stereotypes than substance, more on image than experience. He'd come to Millfield expecting to find predictable antagonists, men whose response to challenge would validate his own aggressive approach to conflict resolution. Instead, he'd found something infinitely more complex, men whose commitment to their code included protecting the vulnerable, whose definition of strength encompassed compassion, whose understanding of family extended beyond blood and leather to include anyone who needed help. "I don't understand," Marcus said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. I mean, everyone knows what the Hells Angels are about. Everyone knows what you guys do." "Do they?" Jake asked gently, rising to his full height but maintaining the kind of non-threatening posture that invited conversation rather than confrontation. "Or do they know what the movies tell them, what the newspapers write about us? What do the cops say when they're trying to justify their budgets?" He gestured around the room, taking in the decorations and the donation jars and the faces of people who'd come together to help one of their own. "Look around, son. Look at what we're actually doing here. Look at who we're actually helping. And then ask yourself whether your assumptions match the reality."
Marcus looked around the community center with eyes that seemed to be seeing it clearly for the first time since he'd arrived. The colorful streamers and handmade signs, the tables laden with homemade food, the families who had come together to support Emma's fight against cancer. It was as far from his preconceptions about biker gatherings as anything he could have imagined. But more importantly, he was beginning to understand that his arrival had threatened something precious, something that had taken hours to build and could have been destroyed in minutes. The tentative bridges between the angels and the townspeople, the growing sense of community that had developed around Emma's fundraiser, the possibility that people from different worlds could find common ground. All of it had been endangered by his need to prove something that suddenly seemed insignificant. "We came here because we heard the angels were in town," he said slowly, his voice carrying the weight of growing comprehension. We thought you were here to cause trouble. We thought we needed to protect people from you." "And instead," said Raven, her voice gentle but pointed, "you brought the only trouble this community has seen all evening." The truth of her statement hit Marcus like a slap, forcing him to confront the reality that he and his crew had been the only source of intimidation and fear in the community center. The angels had been nothing but respectful, had integrated themselves into the fundraiser with grace and genuine warmth, had proven themselves to be exactly what they claimed, people who had come to help. Tommy Quick Martinez, who had been struggling with his own demons throughout the evening, found himself stepping forward with the kind of hesitant courage that comes from recognizing a kindred spirit in unexpected places. "Marcus," he said quietly, "my little sister died of cancer when she was 9. I spent 2 years watching her fight for her life, watching my parents go bankrupt trying to save her, watching our whole family fall apart because we couldn't afford the treatment she needed." He looked around the room, taking in the faces of people who had come together to prevent other families from experiencing what his had endured. If someone like Mr. Morrison had walked into our lives back then, if someone had been willing to help without asking for anything in return, maybe Maria would still be alive. Maybe my family wouldn't have fallen apart. Maybe everything would have been different. The confession hung in the air like a bridge between worlds, connecting Tommy's loss to Emma's fight, Marcus's confusion to Jake's quiet generosity, the Nightwolf's misguided aggression to the angel's unexpected compassion. It was the kind of human truth that transcended club colors and territorial disputes, revealing the shared experiences that connected people across the artificial boundaries that society tried to impose.
Emma, who had been listening to these adult conversations with the kind of serious attention that children bring to subjects they instinctively understand, walked over to where Marcus stood and looked up at him with eyes that held no judgment, only curiosity. "Are you sad?" she asked simply, her small hand reaching out to touch his leather jacket with the fearless trust that had characterized all her interactions that evening. "You look sad. Do you want to see my drawings? Sometimes pretty pictures make sad feelings better." Marcus looked down at Emma with something approaching wonder, as if he were seeing her clearly for the first time since entering the community center. Here was the person he had claimed to be protecting, the community member whose safety he had used to justify his aggressive challenge to the angels. And she was offering him comfort, extending kindness to someone who had brought nothing but disruption to her special evening. "I am sad," he admitted, his voice rough with emotions he'd been suppressing for months. "I'm sad and angry and confused about a lot of things, but mostly I'm sorry for ruining your party." "You didn't ruin it," Emma said, with the kind of absolute certainty that only children possess. "Parties aren't about everything being perfect, they're about people being together and helping each other and remembering that love is stronger than scared feelings." The simplicity of her philosophy hit everyone in the room with unexpected force, reducing complex adult conflicts to their most basic elements: fear versus love, isolation versus community, the choice between building walls and building bridges. An 8-year-old had managed to articulate truths that the adults had been struggling to understand all evening. Dr. Sarah Chen felt tears beginning to gather in her eyes as she watched her daughter extend grace to someone who had threatened the peace of their fundraiser. This was why she'd organized the event, why she'd reached out to motorcycle clubs despite her own prejudices, why she'd been willing to risk her professional reputation to help other families avoid the financial devastation that cancer could bring. Emma embodied everything the fundraiser was meant to represent: the belief that people were fundamentally good, that community could overcome division, that love was indeed stronger than fear. Watching her offer comfort to Marcus, seeing her refuse to let adult conflicts diminish her faith in human nature, Sarah understood that her daughter was teaching lessons that went far beyond raising money for medical bills. Sheriff Brennan, who had been watching the entire confrontation unfold with the kind of professional detachment that came from years of managing conflicts, found himself reassessing not just the immediate situation, but his own assumptions about the people he was sworn to protect and serve. The Night Wolves had arrived with obvious aggressive intent, had disrupted a peaceful community event, had threatened violence against people who were doing nothing but trying to help sick children. But they were also young, obviously confused about the realities of outlaw culture, and apparently motivated by a misguided desire to protect their community from what they perceived as a threat. They deserved consequences for their actions, but they also deserved the chance to learn from their mistakes and find better ways to channel their protective instincts. "Mr. Rodriguez," Harold said, his voice carrying the kind of official authority that commanded attention, but stopping short of the aggressive tone he might have used in other circumstances. "I think it's time for you and your crew to make a decision about how this evening ends." Marcus looked around the room one more time, taking in the faces of people who had every right to hate him, but who were instead offering him the chance to redeem himself. Walter Kozlowski's weathered features held no anger, only the patient hope of someone who believed in the possibility of human growth. Jake Morrison's eyes carried the kind of understanding that came from men who had made their own share of mistakes and learned from them. But Emma's expectant smile that finally broke through the last of his defensive walls, her absolute faith that he would choose to be better than he had been, that made the decision inevitable. "We're sorry," he said finally, his voice carrying across the silent room with the weight of genuine remorse. "We came here thinking we were protecting our community, but all we did was threaten the people who were actually helping it. That's not what real bikers do. That's not what real men do." He looked directly at Jake, his young face serious in a way that made him appear older than his 24 years. "Mr. Morrison, we disrespected you and your club based on ignorance and stupidity. If you'll have us, we'd like to contribute to Emma's fundraiser and learn what it really means to be part of something bigger than ourselves." The offer hung in the air for a moment before Jake stepped forward and extended his hand to the young man who had challenged him so aggressively just minutes earlier. "Son," he said with genuine warmth, "the best bikers I know are the ones who figured out that being an outlaw sometimes means standing up for people who can't stand up for themselves. Welcome to the real rebellion."
As the two men shook hands, the community center erupted in spontaneous applause, the sound washing over everyone present like a cleansing rain after a drought. The tentative bridges that had been threatened were not just restored but strengthened, and the evening that had begun as a simple fundraiser had become something approaching a miracle. The transformation in the community center was immediate and profound, as if Marcus's apology had broken some invisible barrier that had been holding back the full potential of the evening. Within minutes of the handshake between Jake and the young Nightwolf's leader, the atmosphere shifted from cautious reconciliation to genuine celebration, with the energy of people who had witnessed something extraordinary and wanted to be part of its continuation. Emma became the unofficial ambassador between the two groups of bikers, her natural curiosity and complete lack of prejudice serving as a bridge that allowed conversations to flow in ways that formal introductions never could have achieved. She took Marcus by the hand and led him to her art station, chattering excitedly about her motorcycle drawings while he listened with the kind of focused attention that suggested he was trying to understand not just her pictures, but the worldview they represented. "This one's special," Emma said, holding up a crayon drawing of two motorcycles riding side by side under a rainbow. "It's called Friends on the Road, because sometimes people who seem different are really the same underneath. My mom says that's what hope looks like, finding out that scary things aren't really scary at all." Marcus studied the drawing with the seriousness it deserved, recognizing in its simple imagery a truth that had eluded him for 24 years. The two motorcycles in Emma's picture weren't competing or fighting, they were traveling together, their differences in style and color making them more interesting rather than less compatible. "Emma," he said softly,
"Do you think I could buy this picture from you? For the fundraiser, I mean. I'd like to give it to my little sister." "You have a little sister?" Emma asked, her eyes lighting up with the kind of enthusiasm she reserved for particularly wonderful discoveries. "I do," Marcus replied, surprising himself with how easily the admission came. "Her name is Isabella, and she's 7 years old. She loves to draw, too, and I think she'd really like to meet you someday." "I'd like that," Emma said with the kind of immediate acceptance that children bring to new friendships. "Maybe she could come to my next fundraiser. We could draw motorcycles together." Jake Morrison watched this interaction from across the room, feeling something settle in his chest that he hadn't experienced in years. The sense that cycles could be broken, that patterns of conflict and misunderstanding could be interrupted by simple human connection. Marcus wasn't the first young writer who had challenged the angels based on misconceptions, and he wouldn't be the last. But he might be one of the few who had the chance to learn what the Brotherhood was really about before it was too late. Dr. Sarah Chen found herself standing next to Jake as they both observed the growing friendship between Emma and Marcus, two people who should have been natural enemies, but who had instead found common ground in crayons and hope. "I owe you an apology," Sarah said quietly, her voice carrying the kind of professional honesty that had served her well in medical practice. "When I called your club, I was desperate enough to reach out, but still prejudiced enough to expect the worst. I thought you might show up, make some donations, take some pictures for publicity, and leave. I never imagined." She gestured around the room, taking in the sight of leather-clad bikers helping elderly volunteers set up auction displays, sport bike riders comparing notes with Harley riders about maintenance and modifications, and children who had overcome their initial wariness to engage with people their parents had taught them to fear. "You never imagined we were human," Jake finished gently, his voice holding no accusation, only understanding. "Dr. Chen, most people's knowledge of the Hells Angels comes from movies and news reports about our worst members doing their worst things. We don't exactly go out of our way to publicize the charity rides and the hospital visits and the times we step up for communities in trouble." "Why not?" Sarah asked, her medical training making her naturally curious about motivations and systems. "Because sometimes being feared is more useful than being understood. There are people in this world who prey on the weak, who take advantage of communities that can't protect themselves. They don't respond to reasoned arguments or legal processes. They respond to the knowledge that if they mess with certain people, certain communities, there will be consequences." He turned to look at Sarah directly, his weathered faces serious in the way that came from men who had seen too much of the world's darkness to pretend it didn't exist. "But here's the thing about reputation. It cuts both ways. The same image that makes predators think twice also makes good people afraid to ask for help when they need it. That's why what you did, reaching out despite your fears, was so important. You gave us the chance to be the better angels of our nature."
The phrase hung in the air between them, and Sarah found herself thinking about the careful balance between protection and perception, between the power to intimidate and the choice to nurture. It was a complexity she hadn't considered before, the idea that the same qualities that made someone dangerous to enemies could make them invaluable to friends. Across the room, Tommy Quick Martinez was having his own revelation as he watched the youngest Nightwolves interact with Emma and the other children at the fundraiser. Several of Marcus's crew were barely out of their teens themselves, young men who had joined the sport bike group for the same reasons Tommy had joined the Angels, because they were looking for family, for belonging, for something bigger than themselves to believe in. But watching them now, seeing how quickly their aggressive posturing had given way to genuine engagement with the community they had claimed to be protecting, Tommy realized that the Angels had something these young riders didn't: purpose beyond rebellion, meaning beyond membership, a code that extended beyond the Brotherhood to encompass responsibility for something larger than themselves. "Hey," he said, approaching Marcus as the young man finished examining Emma's artwork. "Mind if I ask you something?" Marcus looked up with the kind of wariness that came from someone who had spent the evening having his assumptions challenged. "Shoot." "What made you think you needed to protect this community from us?" Tommy asked.
his voice carrying genuine curiosity rather than challenge. "I mean, specifically, what did you think we were going to do?" Marcus considered the question for a moment, his face reflecting the kind of internal struggle that comes from trying to articulate beliefs that suddenly seem indefensible. "Honestly," he said finally, "I don't think I thought it through that far. We heard the Hells Angels were coming to town, and it seemed like something we should respond to. Like if we didn't do something, we'd look weak or irrelevant, or like we didn't matter. So it wasn't really about protecting anyone," Tommy observed gently. "It was about proving that you mattered." The insight hit Marcus like a physical blow, forcing him to confront the reality that his motivations had been more about ego than altruism, more about his own need for significance than any genuine concern for community safety. "Yeah," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I guess it was. And that makes me pretty much the opposite of what I thought I was, doesn't it?" "No," Tommy said, his voice carrying the kind of understanding that came from someone who had wrestled with similar demons. "It makes you human. The question is what you do with that knowledge." He gestured toward the fundraiser activity continuing around them, the sight of people from different worlds working together toward a common goal. The thing about being part of something bigger than yourself is that it's not about proving you matter. It matters because you contribute, because you make things better, because you show up when people need help, even if they never know your name. Marcus looked around the room with new eyes, seeing for the first time what real community involvement looked like. It wasn't about territorial dominance or public recognition. It was about elderly farmers sharing stories with tattooed bikers, young mothers trusting their children to the care of people they'd been taught to fear, sick children finding hope in the kindness of strangers who had no obligation to care. "How do I learn to do that?" Marcus asked, his voice carrying the kind of vulnerable honesty that marked the beginning of real growth. "How do I become the kind of person who shows up for the right reasons?" "You start by showing up," Tommy replied simply. "You keep coming to things like this. You find ways to help that don't require anyone to know it was you. You learn that the best rebels are the ones who rebel against the idea that people can't change, can't be better, can't find common ground despite their differences." The conversation was interrupted by a commotion near the front of the room, where Sheriff Brennan was talking quietly but urgently into his radio. Harold's expression was serious in a way that made experienced people pay attention, and Jake found himself moving toward the lawman with the kind of instinctive alertness that came from decades of reading dangerous situations. "Sheriff? Problem?" Jake asked quietly. Harold looked up from his radio with the kind of grim expression that suggested the evening's peaceful resolution might be temporary. "Maybe. Got a report of a group of riders heading this way from Lincoln. Not sure who they are or what they want, but they're moving fast and in formation." Jake felt his stomach tighten as he processed this information. The fragile peace that had been built between the Angels, the Night Wolves, and the community could be shattered by the arrival of another group with unknown intentions and uncertain loyalties.
"How many?" he asked, his mind already running through tactical possibilities and escape routes. "Dispatch says maybe 20, 25. Could be nothing, could be riders heading to some other event, but given everything that's happened tonight, I thought you should know." Jake nodded, appreciating the sheriff's professional courtesy in sharing the information rather than simply assuming the worst. But he also understood the implications. If another group of bikers arrived with aggressive intentions, the townspeople would likely assume that all the evening's peaceful interactions had been elaborate deceptions, that their trust had been misplaced. "I need to tell my people," Jake said, "and I think Marcus should know too. If these new riders are looking for trouble, they might target his crew as well as mine." The word spread quickly but quietly through the community center, passed along through subtle glances and brief conversations that didn't alarm the civilians but ensured that everyone who needed to know was prepared. The Angels moved into defensive positions with practiced efficiency, while Marcus and his Night Wolves found themselves automatically coordinating with their former adversaries in the face of a potential common threat.
Emma, with the uncanny awareness that children often possess for adult tensions, noticed the subtle changes in atmosphere and approached Jake with obvious concern. "Mr. Jake," she tugged on his leather vest, "are the grown-ups getting scared again? Did I do something wrong?" Jake knelt down to Emma's eye level, struck once again by the child's ability to cut through complex adult emotions to reach fundamental truths. "No, sweetheart," he said gently, "you haven't done anything wrong. Some more motorcycle people might be coming, and we just want to make sure everyone stays safe. That's a promise." Emma nodded with the kind of absolute trust that Jake's chest tightened with the weight of responsibility. "Okay," she said simply, "but if they're mean, maybe I should talk to them. I'm really good at helping people stop being mean." The offer was so innocent, so genuinely well-intentioned, that Jake felt tears threatening to gather in his eyes. Here was a child who had just witnessed one group of potentially dangerous bikers transform into allies, and her takeaway wasn't fear, but confidence in her ability to facilitate that transformation again. "That's very brave of you," Jake said softly, "but this time the grown-ups are going to handle it, okay? Your job is to keep being exactly who you are, the kind of person who believes people can be better than they seem." The sound of approaching motorcycles grew louder, but these engines had a different note than the sport bikes it carried, deeper, more traditional, the distinctive rumble of Harley-Davidson V-twins that spoke of riders who valued heritage over speed. Jake felt some of his tension ease as he recognized the sound, though he remained cautious about making assumptions. Through the front windows, they could see the approaching convoy now, a long line of motorcycles moving with the kind of disciplined formation that suggested either military experience or serious club affiliation. As they drew closer, Jake was able to make out details that brought a smile to his weathered features. The lead rider was wearing colors he recognized, the distinctive patches of the Veterans MC, a club composed entirely of military veterans who had found brotherhood on the road after serving their country in uniform. Behind him rode members of several other clubs that Jake knew to be legitimate organizations committed to charity work and community service. "Well, I'll be damned," Dutch Hamaker said, moving to stand beside Jake at the window. "Looks like word got out about what we were doing here." The revelation that the approaching riders were allies rather than threats spread through the community center like a wave of relief, but it also brought a new understanding of just how interconnected the motorcycle community really was. News of the Angels' charity work had spread through informal networks that connected clubs across the region, bringing reinforcements that nobody had asked for, but everyone was grateful to see. The Veterans MC president was a man named Samuel Washington, a former Army chaplain whose deep faith and commitment to service had made him a respected figure throughout the motorcycle community. He dismounted his Harley with the deliberate precision of someone whose military bearing had never left him, even though he was 68 years old and retired for more than a decade. "Jake Morrison," Preacher said, extending his hand with genuine warmth. "Heard you boys were down here doing the Lord's work. Thought we'd stop by and see if you needed any help." "Preacher," Jake replied, clasping the older man's hand with obvious respect. "Good to see you, brother. We're just about wrapped up here, but I appreciate you making the ride."
"Actually," said Dr. Sarah Chen, stepping forward with the kind of professional confidence that came from recognizing an unexpected opportunity, "if you gentlemen have a few minutes, I'd love to talk to you about something." She gestured toward the donation jars and auction items that had raised far more money than anyone had dared hope. "Tonight has been more successful than we ever imagined, both financially and in terms of community building. But it's also made me realize that there are probably other families out there, other communities, that could benefit from this kind of support." The preacher's eyes lit up with the kind of interest that came from men who had dedicated their post-military lives to finding new ways to serve.
"What are you thinking, Doc?"
"I'm thinking about a network," Sarah said, her voice gaining strength as the idea took shape. "A way to connect motorcycle clubs with communities that need help, families facing medical crises, fundraising events that could use the kind of support you've shown us tonight." She looked around the room, taking in the sight of bikers and townspeople working together, former enemies sharing stories and laughter, children who had learned that their assumptions about dangerous strangers might be completely wrong. "Tonight proved that when people get past their preconceptions and work together, amazing things can happen," she continued.
But it also proved that most of us, myself included, never would have reached out if we hadn't been desperate enough to overcome our fears. What if we could change that? What if we could build bridges before crises force us to? The idea resonated through the room like a struck bell, creating ripples of excitement and possibility that touched everyone present. Jake found himself thinking about the potential for expanding their charitable work beyond sporadic responses to individual requests, about creating systematic approaches to community support that could make real differences in people's lives. Marcus Rodriguez, still processing his own transformation from antagonist to ally, felt something stirring in his chest that he'd never experienced before, the possibility of being part of something that mattered beyond his own need for recognition and respect.
Dr. Chen, if you're serious about building something like this, I'd like to help. My crew and we made a lot of mistakes tonight, but we learned from them. Maybe we could help other riders learn without making the same mistakes.
Walter Kozlowski, who had been listening to these conversations with the kind of quiet satisfaction that comes from watching seeds take root, cleared his throat with the deliberate authority of someone preparing to speak truth. "Seems to me," he said, his weathered voice carrying clearly across the room, "that what we've got here is bigger than any one fundraiser or any one community. What we've got here is proof that the things that divide people are usually smaller than the things that connect them." He gestured toward Emma, who was now surrounded by bikers from 3 different clubs, all of them examining her artwork with the kind of serious attention usually reserved for museum pieces. "That little girl taught us all something tonight," Walter continued. "She taught us that courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about doing the right thing even when you are afraid. She taught us that hope isn't about everything being perfect. It's about believing that people can be better than their worst moments." The elderly farmer's words seemed to crystallize everything the evening had represented, transforming individual acts of kindness and moments of reconciliation into something approaching a movement, a philosophy, a way of understanding what community could mean when people chose connection over division. Emma, hearing her name mentioned, looked up from her artwork with the kind of bright attention that suggested she'd been following the adult conversation more closely than anyone had realized. "Are you talking about making more fundraisers?" she asked with obvious excitement. "Because I have lots more pictures to sell, and I know other kids who are sick who might want to have parties too." "We're talking about more than fundraisers, sweetheart," Jake said gently. "We're talking about building a family that's big enough to include everyone who needs help and everyone who wants to help. A family that rides motorcycles and grows corn and fixes broken things and takes care of each other no matter what they look like or where they come from." Emma considered this for a moment, with a seriousness she brought to all important questions. "That sounds like the biggest family ever," she said finally. "I like big families. There's more people to love and more people to love you back." The simple wisdom of her response seemed to settle over the room like a benediction, confirming what everyone present had learned through the course of the evening, that the most profound truths often came from the most innocent sources. The children understood things about love and acceptance that adults spent lifetimes trying to relearn. As the formal fundraiser began to wind down and people started the process of cleaning up and saying goodbyes, Jake Morrison found himself standing in the parking lot surrounded by motorcycles that represented dozens of different clubs, hundreds of individual stories, and one shared commitment to the idea that families could be chosen as well as born. The evening had started with 12 Hells Angels arriving to help with a charity event. It was ending with more than 40 bikers from multiple clubs, along with an entire community committed to building something that none of them could have imagined when the sun set over the Nebraska prairie just a few hours earlier. Emma's fundraiser had been a success by any measure. They'd raised enough money to help dozens of families facing medical crises, had brought together people who might never have met otherwise, had proven that assumptions could be challenged and prejudices could be overcome. But more than that, it had become the foundation for something larger, something that would outlast the evening and extend far beyond the borders of Millfield. It had become proof that the world could be changed, one conversation at a time, one act of kindness at a time, one child's belief in the fundamental goodness of humanity at a time. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Nebraska State Fairgrounds as hundreds of motorcycles rolled into what had become the largest charity gathering in the Midwest. The annual Emma's Angels rally had grown from a single evening fundraiser in a small-town community center to a 3-day event that drew riders from across the country, all united by a story that had become legend in the motorcycle community. The night when a little girl's wisdom had transformed enemies into family. Jake Morrison, now 63 and sporting more gray in his beard than black, sat astride his 1975 shovelhead in the staging area, watching the organized chaos of arrival with the kind of quiet satisfaction that came from seeing a dream made manifest. The Death's Head patch on his vest looked the same as it had 5 years ago, but the man wearing it had been changed in ways that went deeper than appearance, transformed by the understanding that the most rebellious thing an outlaw could do was choose love over fear. Beside him, Emma Chen, now 13 and cancer-free for 4 years running, adjusted the straps of her own leather vest, a miniature version of the Angels' colors that had been specially made for her honorary membership in the club. She'd grown taller and stronger, but her eyes still held the same combination of wisdom and innocence that had stopped a war before it started on that September evening that seemed like yesterday and a lifetime ago. Nervous? Jake asked, glancing at the young teenager who had become not just the inspiration for the rally, but its unofficial ambassador to the world. Excited, Emma replied, her voice carrying the kind of confident enthusiasm that came from someone who had learned early that she could trust in the goodness of strangers. Mom says there are families here from 37 states this year. 37! That's more than last year. Jake nodded, remembering when Dr. Sarah Chen's vision of a network connecting motorcycle clubs with communities in need had seemed like an impossible dream. Now, the Angels Network included more than 200 clubs across North America, had facilitated millions of dollars in charitable giving, and had become a model for how disparate communities could work together toward common goals. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. Building trust between groups that had spent decades viewing each other with suspicion required patience, persistence, and countless hours of relationship building that took place far from any cameras or publicity. But Emma's story had provided the foundation, the proof that connections were possible even across the widest cultural divides. "There's Marcus," Emma said, pointing toward the entrance where a familiar figure was directing traffic with the kind of practiced efficiency that spoke of years of event management experience. Marcus Rodriguez, now 29 and the regional coordinator for the Angels Network's youth outreach program, had undergone his own remarkable transformation in the 5 years since that confrontational evening in Millfield. The angry young men who had once challenged the Hells Angels based on misconceptions and territorial pride had become one of the most effective advocates for community-based charitable work in the motorcycle world. He'd kept his sport bike, a pristine Yamaha R1 that he maintained with obsessive care, but he'd also learned to ride Harleys and had earned the respect of old-school bikers through his dedication to the cause rather than his adherence to tradition. More importantly, he'd learned to channel his natural leadership abilities toward building bridges rather than defending territories. "Marcus looks busy," Jake observed, watching the younger man coordinate the arrival of what appeared to be a convoy of family cars and minivans alongside the expected motorcycles. "That's the best part," Emma said, her eyes lighting up with the enthusiasm she reserved for discussing the rally's expanding mission. "It's not just about bikers helping families anymore. It's about everyone helping everyone. Mrs. Patterson, you remember Mrs. Patterson from the apple pies? She's been teaching cooking classes to biker families. And Mr. Diesel has been helping the Henderson family rebuild their barn after the tornado." The evolution of the rally reflected broader changes in how the participating communities understood themselves and each other. What had started as motorcycle clubs providing financial assistance to families facing medical crises had grown into a complex network of mutual support that crossed traditional social boundaries in ways that would have seemed impossible 5 years earlier. Walter Kozlowski, now 79 and moving more slowly but still sharp as a tack, had become something of a philosopher for the movement.
His speeches at ET's opening ceremony drawing standing ovations from audiences that included everyone from federal judges to ex-convicts, from suburban soccer moms to leather-clad outlaws. "There he is," Emma said, spotting Walter's distinctive figure near the main stage, where he was testing the microphone system with the kind of methodical attention to detail that had served him well through 7 decades of farming. "He looks good this year. I was worried about him after his heart attack." Jake felt the familiar tightness in his chest that came from being reminded of mortality's persistent presence. Walter's mild heart attack 6 months earlier had been a wake-up call for everyone who had come to depend on his steady wisdom and gentle guidance. But the elderly farmer had recovered with typical stubbornness, insisting that he had too much work left to do to let something as minor as cardiac issues slow him down. "Walter's too tough to let a little thing like a heart attack stop him," Jake said, though he made a mental note to keep an eye on his friend throughout the weekend's activities. "Besides, he's got that speech to give tomorrow. He's been working on it for months." The opening ceremony speech had become the rally's most anticipated event, drawing not just participants but media attention from across the country. Walter's ability to articulate the philosophical foundations of what they were building, the idea that community could transcend traditional boundaries, that family could be chosen as well as inherited, had made him an unlikely spokesperson for a movement that defied easy categorization. This year's speech was expected to be particularly significant, as Walter had been working with Dr. Sarah Chen to announce the establishment of the Emma Chen Foundation, a formal organization that would institutionalize and expand the Angels Network's work beyond what grassroots volunteerism could achieve. "Emma," called a familiar voice, and they turned to see Tommy Martinez approaching on foot, his face beaming with the kind of joy that came from reuniting with family after too long apart. Tommy had left the Angels 3 years earlier to pursue a degree in social work, but he returned every year for the rally, and his ongoing friendship with Emma had become one of the movement's most cherished traditions. "Tommy," Emma replied, sliding off her position behind Jake to embrace the young man who had helped teach her that healing could come from helping others heal. "How's school? Are you still going to graduate next spring?" "Dean's List again," Tommy said proudly, his transformation from angry young biker to dedicated social worker representing one of the rally's most powerful success stories. "And yes, I'll graduate in May. Dr. Chen already offered me a position with the foundation, assuming I want it." "Do you want it?" Emma asked with the directness that remained her trademark, even as she'd grown from child to teenager. "More than anything," Tommy replied without hesitation. "This whole thing started because your mom was brave enough to ask for help when she needed it. I want to spend my life making sure other families know they can ask too, that there are people who will show up when they're called." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Raven, who had ridden up on her newest acquisition, a restored 1960 Harley Panhead that she'd spent 2 years rebuilding from the frame up. At 45, she remained one of the most respected members of the Angels, but she'd also become the rally's logistics coordinator, a role that required diplomatic skills that complemented her mechanical expertise. "Jake," she said, pulling off her helmet to reveal graying hair that she wore with the same pride other women displayed jewelry, "we've got a situation you need to know about." Jake felt his old instincts kick in, the automatic assumption that situation meant trouble of the kind that required careful management. "What kind of situation?" "The good kind," Raven replied with a grin that transformed her weathered features. "Channel 7 News just showed up with a film crew. Apparently, they're doing a documentary about the rally for some national program. And get this, the governor's office called. Governor Martinez wants to present Emma with some kind of state award tomorrow during the ceremony." Emma's eyes widened with surprise and something approaching panic. Despite her comfort with the rally and its participants, she'd never quite gotten used to the media attention that sometimes accompanied their work. "Do I have to give a speech? Because I'm really bad at speeches when there are cameras." "You don't have to do anything you don't want to do," Jake assured her, understanding her discomfort. "But if you decide you want to say something, just remember what you told Marcus that first night, that love is stronger than scared feelings. That's all anyone needs to hear." The reminder seemed to steady Emma, and she nodded with the kind of determined acceptance that had characterized her approach to challenges since childhood. "Okay, but if I mess up, you have to promise to help me."
"Always," Jake replied. The simple word carrying the weight of 5 years of chosen family, shared struggles, and mutual support. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of arrivals, registrations, and the complex logistics of managing an event that had grown far beyond what any of its organizers had originally envisioned. By noon, the fairgrounds hosted more than 3,000 motorcycles, 200 family cars, dozens of vendor booths, and a medical tent staffed by volunteer doctors and nurses who had become part of the rally's extended family. Dr. Emma Chen moved through the crowds with the kind of confident efficiency that came from someone who had learned to manage complex systems under pressure. At 42, she'd become not just the rally's medical coordinator, but its de facto chief operating officer, the person who somehow managed to keep all the moving parts working together toward common goals. She'd taken a leave of absence from her hospital position 2 years earlier to focus full-time on the foundation's work, a decision that had surprised many of her medical colleagues but had felt inevitable to anyone who'd watched her discover her true calling in community organizing rather than clinical practice. "Mom," Emma called, jogging over from where she'd been examining a display of vintage motorcycles with the kind of technical interest that suggested she'd been absorbing more mechanical knowledge than anyone had realized. "Mrs. Patterson wants to know if we can add a cooking competition to next year's rally. She thinks it would be fun to see which club makes the best chili." Sarah laughed, struck by the image of leather-clad bikers competing in culinary arts alongside their traditional bike shows and charity auctions. "What do you think? Would the Angels be interested in a chili cook-off?" "Are you kidding?" Emma replied with obvious enthusiasm. "Mr. Diesel has been bragging about his secret recipe for 3 years. I think he's been waiting for exactly this kind of challenge." The easy banter between mother and daughter reflected one of the rally's most important achievements, the demonstration that families could be strengthened rather than threatened by involvement in communities that extended beyond traditional boundaries. Emma's relationship with her biker family hadn't replaced her connection to her mother, but had enriched it, providing additional sources of support and wisdom that complemented rather than competed with parental guidance. "Dr. Chen," called a voice behind them, and they turned to see Sheriff Harold Brennan approaching with the kind of relaxed confidence that came from someone who no longer saw large gatherings of bikers as potential problems to be managed. Harold, now 68 and planning his retirement, had become one of the rally's most enthusiastic supporters, often spending his vacation time helping with security and logistics. "Sheriff," Sarah replied warmly, "how are the traffic patterns looking? Any problems with the new routing system?" "Smooth as silk," Harold said with obvious pride. "Maricus and his team have it down to a science. Cars flowing in from the east, bikes from the west, vendors from the south. It's like watching a choreographed dance." The sheriff's transformation had been almost as dramatic as anyone's, evolving from cautious law enforcement officer to active advocate for the kinds of community partnerships that the rally represented. His department now worked closely with motorcycle clubs throughout the region, recognizing them as valuable allies in maintaining public safety rather than potential threats to be monitored. "Dr. Chen, any word from the State Patrol about the governor's visit tomorrow?" "All set," Harold replied. "Governor Martinez will arrive at 10, present Emma with the award at 11, and stay for lunch if his schedule permits. His advance team was impressed by the organization here. Apparently, this is the smoothest running event they've ever coordinated security for." The pride in Harold's voice reflected broader changes in how law enforcement agencies had come to view the rally and the movement it represented. What had once been seen as a potential security risk was now recognized as a model for community engagement and positive social change. As the afternoon wore on, the fairgrounds filled with the sights and sounds that had become synonymous with the Emma's Angels rally. Children who might never have seen motorcycles up close were receiving riding safety lessons from experienced bikers. Families, sharing their stories of medical challenges and recovery, were finding support from people who understood their struggles.
Vendors were selling everything from motorcycle parts to handmade crafts, with all proceeds going to the foundation's charitable work. But perhaps most importantly, the barriers that normally separated different communities were dissolving in ways that reminded everyone present why they'd committed to this work in the first place. Near the main stage, Dutch Hammaker, now 71 and officially retired from club leadership but still influential in the motorcycle community, was deep in conversation with a group of military veterans on the intersection of service, community, and finding purpose after traumatic experiences. His weathered features showed the lines that came from decades of hard living, but his eyes held the kind of peace that came from men who had found meaning in their later years. The thing about trauma, Dutch was saying to the veterans, several of whom were dealing with the visible and invisible wounds of recent conflicts, is that it can either isolate you or connect you to everyone else who's ever struggled. The choice is yours, but choosing a connection is always harder and always worth it.
Nearby, Preacher Washington was leading an informal religious service that drew participants from across the denominational spectrum. His message of universal love and acceptance resonated with people who had found spiritual community in unexpected places. The sight of tattooed bikers and suburban families praying together would have seemed impossible 5 years earlier, but it had become one of the rally's most cherished traditions. As evening approached, the formal activities gave way to the kind of spontaneous interactions that represented the rally's true heart. Campfires were lit throughout the grounds, creating intimate spaces where stories could be shared and relationships deepened. Musicians unpacked guitars and harmonicas, filling the air with everything from traditional country to classic rock to spirituals that seemed to speak to universal human experiences. Jake found himself sitting around one of these fires with Emma, Walter, and a dozen others, watching the flames dance against the darkening sky while listening to conversations that ranged from motorcycle maintenance to philosophy to plans for next year's expansion of the network's activities. "You know what I love most about this?" Emma said, her voice thoughtful in the way that suggested she was processing deeper truths than her 13 years might suggest. "It's not just that we help people, although that's important. It's that we prove things can be different than what everyone expects." Walter nodded slowly, his weathered features reflecting the firelight in ways that made him look both ancient and timeless. "That's the real rebellion, isn't it? Refusing to accept that the world has to be divided, that different groups can't work together, that change is impossible. The world told us that bikers and suburban families couldn't trust each other. It told us that young people and old people couldn't understand each other, that law enforcement and outlaws couldn't work together, that sick families and healthy families didn't have anything in common. And we proved the world was wrong," Emma concluded, with the kind of simple satisfaction that came from someone who had spent her formative years learning that assumptions could be challenged and barriers could be overcome. The conversation continued late into the night, touching on everything from specific plans for the Foundation's expansion to broader questions about the nature of community and family in an increasingly fragmented world. But underlying all the practical discussions and philosophical reflections was a sense of gratitude for the journey that had brought them all together. The recognition that what had started as a single evening's charity event had become something that none of them could have imagined. As the fires died down and people began drifting toward their tents and hotel rooms, Jake found himself walking the quiet grounds with Emma, both of them reluctant to end that day that had reminded them why they'd committed to this work in the first place. "Jake," Emma said as they paused near the memorial wall that had been erected to honor families who had lost their battles with cancer, "do you think my dad would be proud of what we've built here?" The question caught Jake off guard, as Emma rarely spoke about the father she'd lost to a car accident when she was 3 years old.
But looking at her now, 13 years old, cancer-free, surrounded by a chosen family that spanned the country, he had no doubt about the answer. "Sweetheart, I think your dad would be amazed by the woman you're becoming and the family you've helped create. I think he'd be proud beyond words." Emma nodded, seemingly satisfied with the response, and they continued their walk in comfortable silence. Around them, the fairgrounds were settling into the quiet rhythm of a community at rest. But tomorrow would bring new arrivals, new stories, and new opportunities to prove that the barriers between people were usually smaller than the bridges that could connect them. The next morning dawned clear and bright, perfect weather for the rally's main ceremony and the governor's visit. By 9 o'clock, the main stage area was packed with participants and spectators, creating an audience that would have been impossible to imagine when the first fundraiser had been held in Millfield's community center 5 years earlier. Governor Maria Martinez, no relation to Marcus Rodriguez despite sharing a surname, arrived precisely on time, accompanied by a small entourage that included several state legislators who had become supporters of the Angels Network's work. At 55, the governor had built her political career on pragmatic problem-solving and bipartisan cooperation, making her a natural ally for a movement that transcended traditional political boundaries. "Ladies and gentlemen," Walter said into the microphone, his voice carrying clearly across the assembled crowd, "it's my great honor to introduce someone who has proven that effective leadership means bringing people together rather than driving them apart. Please welcome Governor Maria Martinez." The applause was enthusiastic but respectful, reflecting the crowd's appreciation for political leaders who supported their work without attempting to exploit it for partisan gain. Governor Martinez approached the podium with the kind of confident warmth that had made her popular across party lines. "5 years ago," she began, her voice carrying the authority that came from experienced public speaking, "a little girl named Emma Chen was fighting cancer while her mother fought bankruptcy trying to pay for her treatment. A motorcycle club known more for its fearsome reputation than its charitable work heard about their struggle and decided to help."
What happened next has become one of the most remarkable stories of community building in our state's history. What started as a single evening's fundraiser has grown into a network that has provided millions of dollars in assistance to families facing medical crises, has brought together communities that had never spoken to each other before, and has proven that the American dream of mutual support and shared responsibility is alive and well in Nebraska. The governor gestured toward Emma, who was standing near the stage with Jake and Sarah, her face showing the kind of nervous excitement that came from being the center of positive attention. "Emma Chen, would you please join me up here?" Emma climbed the stairs to the stage with the kind of determined grace that had characterized her approach to challenges since childhood, accepting the governor's handshake with obvious pride tempered by humility. "Emma," Governor Martinez said, "by the authority vested in me by the state of Nebraska, I hereby present you with the Governor's Award for Outstanding Community Service in recognition of your role in creating a movement that has made our state and our nation stronger, more compassionate, and more united." The award itself, a crystal sculpture depicting hands reaching toward each other across a stylized map of Nebraska, seemed to capture the essence of what the rally represented. But more important than the physical recognition was what it symbolized: official acknowledgement that the work they were doing mattered, that the bridges they were building were valuable, and that the family they had created deserved celebration and support. "Thank you," Emma said into the microphone, her voice clear despite her obvious nervousness. "But I want everyone to know that I didn't do this by myself. This award belongs to everyone who chose to help instead of hurt, who chose to connect instead of divide, who chose to be family, even when family meant including people who seemed different from themselves." She paused, looking out over the crowd that included leather-clad bikers and suburban families, military veterans and college students, law enforcement officers and former outlaws, all united by their commitment to the idea that community could transcend traditional boundaries. 5 years ago, I was a scared little girl with cancer who needed help. Today, I'm part of the biggest, strongest, most loving family in the world, and everyone here is part of that family too, whether you just arrived this morning or you've been riding with us since the beginning. The applause that followed was spontaneous and sustained, reflecting not just appreciation for Emma's words, but recognition of the truth they contained. What had started as a charity event had indeed become a family, one that included thousands of people across dozens of states, all connected by their shared commitment to showing up when help was needed. As the formal ceremony concluded and the crowd began to disperse toward the day's various activities, Jake found himself thinking about the journey that had brought them all to this moment. 5 years ago, he'd been a Hells Angel president whose reputation was built on fear and whose family was limited to his brothers in the club. Today, he was still a Hells Angel president, but his family had expanded to include cancer survivors and their mothers, elderly farmers and sheriffs, young social workers, and state governors, anyone who had learned that love was indeed stronger than fear. The transformation hadn't always been easy. There had been setbacks and misunderstandings, conflicts within the motorcycle community about the wisdom of such public charitable work, political challenges from people who preferred their outlaws to remain safely marginalized. But every obstacle had been overcome by the simple power of relationships built on mutual respect and shared purpose. "Jake!" called a familiar voice, and he turned to see Marcus approaching with a young woman he didn't recognize. "Marcus, I want you to meet someone special. This is my fiancée, Isabella Rodriguez." "Well, she will be Rodriguez after next month's wedding." The young woman stepped forward with a warm smile, extending her hand with obvious respect. "Mr. Morrison, I've heard so much about you and the work you've done here. Marcus has told me how you changed his life, how you taught him what it really means to be part of something bigger than himself." Jake shook her hand, struck by the transformation in Marcus from angry young challenger to mature man capable of building lasting relationships. "Marcus changed his own life. I just provided him with an opportunity to see what was already there." "That's what family does," Isabella said with obvious warmth. "It helps people see the best versions of themselves." The simple statement seemed to encapsulate everything the rally had come to represent, and Jake found himself thinking about all the people who had discovered better versions of themselves through their involvement in the Angels Network. Tommy Martinez finding purpose in social work after years of directionless anger, Sheriff Brennan learning that community policing could mean partnership rather than confrontation, Dr. Sarah Chen discovering that her medical training was just the beginning of her ability to heal communities. Even Jake himself had been transformed, learning that the rebellious spirit that had drawn him to the Angels could be channeled toward building rather than breaking, toward creating family rather than defending territory.
As the afternoon wore on and the rally continued its blend of practical workshops, social activities, and informal relationship building, Jake found himself once again marveling at the diversity of people who had been drawn to their cause. The staging area now hosted not just motorcycles, but also cars and pickup trucks, and even a few RVs, reflecting the movement's expansion beyond its original biker foundation to include anyone committed to community-based charitable work. Near the vendor area, he spotted Dutch Haymaker in animated conversation with a group of college students who had driven down from Lincoln to volunteer for the weekend. The sight of the 71-year-old former outlaw sharing wisdom with young idealists who might never own motorcycles, but who understood the value of service, seemed to perfectly capture the rally's evolution. "The thing about real rebellion," Dutch was saying to the assembled students, "is that it's not about rejecting everything just because it exists. It's about rejecting the things that keep people apart and embracing the things that bring them together."
Nearby, Preacher Washington was leading a workshop on conflict resolution that drew participants from across the ideological spectrum. His message of finding common ground even in the midst of fundamental disagreements resonated with people who had learned that unity didn't require uniformity. But perhaps the most powerful symbol of the rally's success was visible near the medical tent, where Dr. Emma Chen was working alongside volunteer nurses to provide health screenings for anyone who needed them. The sight of a pediatric oncologist using her expertise to serve bikers and their families, many of whom had never had access to quality health care, represented everything the movement stood for. "Dr. Chen," called one of the volunteer nurses, "we've got a family here whose daughter was just diagnosed with leukemia. They don't have insurance, and they're not sure where to turn." Sarah immediately left her current patient and moved toward the family in question, a young couple with a 6-year-old girl whose pale complexion and obvious exhaustion spoke to the reality of her condition. They looked overwhelmed and frightened, the kind of expressions Sarah remembered seeing in her own mirror 5 years earlier. "Hi there," Sarah said gently, kneeling down to the little girl's eye level. "I'm Dr. Chen, and I used to have a little girl who was sick just like you are. Would you like me to tell you about some people who might be able to help?" Jake watched this interaction from a distance, struck by the perfect circle it represented. 5 years earlier, Sarah had been the desperate mother reaching out for help. Today, she was the one providing hope to another family facing the same crisis, offering not just medical expertise, but the hard-won knowledge that families could survive such challenges when they had community support. The rally continued through the evening with the traditional closing ceremony, a campfire gathering that brought together participants from across the weekend's activities for final conversations and commitments to stay connected throughout the coming year. The flames danced against the darkening sky as people shared stories, made plans, and renewed their dedication to the work that had brought them together. "You know, Emma," said Emma, settling into her spot between Jake and Walter around the main fire, "I used to think that having cancer was the worst thing that could ever happen to me. But if I hadn't gotten sick, Mom never would have called the angels, and none of this would exist." Walter nodded slowly, his weathered features reflecting the firelight in ways that seemed to emphasize both his age and his timeless wisdom. "Sometimes the worst things that happen to us become the doorways to the best things we never could have imagined." "That's what Walter told me the first night we met," added Jake, remembering that evening in Millfield when an elderly farmer had challenged his assumptions about who deserved respect and who could be trusted. "And sometimes," Emma said, with the kind of profound simplicity that had characterized her observations since childhood, "the people who look the scariest are actually the ones who understand best what it means to be scared." The conversation continued late into the night, touching on everything from specific plans for next year's rally to broader reflections on the nature of family, community, and the human capacity for transformation. But underlying all the practical discussions and philosophical musings was a sense of completion, the recognition that they had built something remarkable and sustainable, something that would continue to grow and evolve long after any individual participant was gone. As the fires died down and people began to drift toward their accommodations, Jake found himself taking one final walk around the fairgrounds with Emma, both of them reluctant to end a weekend that had reminded them why their work mattered. The grounds were quiet now, filled with the peaceful rhythm of a community at rest. Tomorrow, the motorcycles would roar back to life and scatter across the country, carrying participants back to their regular lives and responsibilities. But they would return changed, renewed in their commitment to the idea that family could be chosen, that community could transcend traditional boundaries, and that love was indeed stronger than fear. "Jake," Emma said as they paused near the memorial wall, "do you think we'll still be doing this when I'm old enough to have my own kids?" Jake smiled, struck by the question's implicit assumption that their work would continue indefinitely, that the family they had built was strong enough to span generations. "I hope so, sweetheart. But more than that, I hope you'll be teaching your kids that family can include anyone who chooses to love and be loved in return."
Emma nodded, seemingly satisfied with the response, and they continued their walk in comfortable silence. Around them, the fairgrounds held the quiet promise of future gatherings, future stories, and future opportunities to prove that the most profound rebellions were the ones that chose connection over division, hope over fear, love over everything that tried to keep people apart. It has become proof that when people choose to see beyond surface differences to recognize shared humanity, there are no limits to what they can build together. And in a world that often seemed determined to emphasize what divided people, that proof had become more valuable than any monetary donation, more powerful than any award, more lasting than any individual recognition. It had become, quite simply, a family, the biggest, strongest, most loving family in the world, open to anyone brave enough to believe that love really was stronger than fear, that community really could transcend traditional boundaries, that sometimes the most dangerous-looking strangers turned out to be exactly the family you never knew you needed. As the sun rose over the Nebraska fairgrounds on Monday morning, casting long shadows across the empty spaces where hundreds of motorcycles had been parked just hours before, the silence held not sadness but anticipation. The riders had scattered back to their homes and responsibilities, but they carried with them the knowledge that they were part of something larger than themselves, something that would endure and grow and continue to transform lives for years to come. And somewhere on a highway heading back toward Omaha, Jake Morrison smiled as he felt the familiar vibration of his Harley-Davidson beneath him, knowing that he was returning home not as the same man who had left 5 years earlier, but as someone who had learned that the most radical thing an outlaw could do was choose love, that the most rebellious act a biker could commit was to prove that family could include anyone brave enough to show up when help was needed. Behind him, the road stretched endlessly toward new adventures, new communities, new opportunities to demonstrate that angels came in all forms, even the leather-clad, tattooed, rumbling motorcycle kind that society had taught people to fear. And ahead of him lay the promise of another year, another rally, another chance to prove that when people choose connection over division, there are no limits to the family they can build together. The circle was complete, but the story would never end. If this incredible true story moved you, please take 30 seconds to like this video and subscribe for more amazing tales of how strangers become family. Share this with someone who needs to hear that love really is stronger than fear, and let me know in the comments which moment hit you the hardest. The Nebraska wind carried different sounds now as it swept across the memorial garden where Emma Chen Morrison stood with her infant daughter, Lily Grace, cradled against her chest. At 23, Emma had inherited her mother's determined spirit and her chosen father's unwavering sense of justice, but her eyes still held that same combination of wisdom and wonder that stopped a war when she was 8 years old. The garden occupied the corner of what had once been the Millfield Community Center's parking lot, transformed into a living monument to the lives touched by the Angels Network. Bronze plaques bearing names and stories created winding pathways between native prairie grasses and wildflowers, while a central fountain featured Emma's original drawing of 2 motorcycles riding side by side under a rainbow, now cast in metal and water, eternal symbols of unity transcending difference. "Tell me again about Great-Grandpa Walter," Emma said softly to the headstone bearing his name, though she spoke as much to her daughter as to the memory of the man who had shaped so much of who she'd become. Walter had passed peacefully 2 years earlier, surrounded by his chosen family of bikers, farmers, doctors, and dreamers who had all learned to see beyond surface differences to the humanity beneath. Jake Morrison, now 73 and moving with the careful dignity of a man whose bones had absorbed decades of highway vibration, approached quietly on the gravel path. His death's head patch remained unchanged, but the man wearing it had become something his younger self could never have imagined. A grandfather figure to hundreds of families, a bridge between worlds that had once seemed irreconcilably separate. He'd say the same thing he always said, that the best way to honor the dead is by living fully, loving freely,
and never forgetting that family can include anyone brave enough to show up when help is needed. Emma shifted Lily to her other arm, marveling at how the infant seemed to calm whenever Jake was near. Her daughter would grow up in a world where leather-clad bikers and suburban soccer parents worked together so naturally that the very idea of division would seem foreign, a legacy that sometimes felt more precious than any material inheritance. "The new families are arriving for tomorrow's ceremony," Emma said, gesturing toward the distant fairgrounds where the 20th annual rally was taking shape. "Marcus called this morning. They're expecting nearly 5,000 motorcycles this year, plus all the support vehicles. The Angels Network has chapters in 47 states now."
Jake nodded, remembering when 12 Hells Angels riding to help one sick child had seemed like a significant gesture. The organization that had grown from that simple act of compassion now operated medical assistance programs, scholarship funds, disaster relief operations, and conflict resolution services that had transformed communities across North America. Dr. Emma Chen Morrison. She'd legally changed her name 5 years earlier when Jake officially adopted Emma as his daughter, emerged from the community center carrying a folder thick with the weekend's logistics. At 52, she moved with the confident efficiency of someone who had learned to manage complex systems under pressure, though her eyes still held the gentle warmth that had made her such an effective healer. "The documentary crew wants to interview all 3 of you tomorrow," she announced, joining them on the bench that had been designed to accommodate the extended families that had become the rally's trademark. Something about the original Miracle family for their 20th anniversary special. Emma smiled, remembering her 8-year-old self's terror at the prospect of television cameras. As long as they understand that there's nothing miraculous about choosing love over fear. That's just what normal people do when they remember they're all part of the same family. The simplicity of her statement would have seemed naive coming from someone who hadn't spent 15 years watching that philosophy transform thousands of lives. But Emma had witnessed enough genuine miracles, families saved from bankruptcy, communities healed from division, young people finding purpose in service, to understand that the most profound truths were often the most accessible ones. As the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the memorial garden, 3 generations of chosen family sat together in comfortable silence, each lost in their own memories of the journey that had brought them to this moment. Around them, the sounds of preparation drifted from the fairgrounds, engines being tuned, tents being erected, families reuniting after months of separation. Tomorrow would bring new stories of struggle and triumph, new opportunities to prove that the barriers between people were usually smaller than the bridges that could connect them. But today was for remembering, for honoring those who had made the journey possible, and for promising that the love they had built together would continue to grow and endure long after any individual voice was silenced. "Walter would have been proud," Jake said finally, his weathered voice carrying the weight of gratitude too large for simple words. "Walter is proud," Emma corrected gently, shifting Lily so the infant could see the fountain where bronze motorcycles rode forever toward an eternal rainbow. "Love like that doesn't die. It just finds new ways to keep growing." And in the gentle Nebraska wind that carried the scent of prairie grass and the distant rumble of arriving motorcycles, it seemed as though Walter Kozlowski's voice whispered its agreement, that family was indeed the only rebellion that mattered, the only revolution that truly endured, the only legacy worth leaving for the children who would inherit the world they had built together. As Marcus and Jake shook hands, the community center erupted in applause. The fundraiser had raised more money than anyone had hoped for, but more importantly, it had proven that enemies could become family when someone was brave enough to choose love over fear.